She lost everything in one night. Her company, her reputation, her future. The man she trusted most stole it all and disappeared without a trace. But just as it all crumbled, the most dangerous man in New York knocked on her door, not to save her, but to offer the coldest deal she'd ever heard. 18 months of marriage in exchange for everything she'd lost. No feelings, no exceptions, just a contract. If you want to know if the heart can beat a contract, hit like, comment the city you're watching from so I know how far my story has progressed, and follow along to the end. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Vivian Mercer's life stopped resembling anything she recognized. She was sitting at what remained of her drafting table, the mahogany one she'd bought herself the year Mercer and Holt Architecture turned its first real profit, the one with a small gouge on the left corner from the time she'd stayed up 42 hours straight, finishing the Halcyon Tower proposal, and dropped her compass in a moment of exhaustion-drunk carelessness. When the courier knocked, she didn't look up immediately. She was staring at a column of numbers on her laptop screen, the kind of numbers that don't announce themselves. They just sit there, quiet and devastating, like a diagnosis delivered in a waiting room with bad lighting. The courier knocked again. She opened the door, still holding her reading glasses. The envelope was white, legal-sized, embossed with the return address of Harmon, Lyle & Associates. She knew that name. She'd been seeing it a lot lately, attached to words like subpoena and breach of fiduciary duty and preliminary injunction. She signed for it. She went back inside. She set it on the kitchen counter next to a half-eaten sleeve of crackers and a mug of cold coffee, and she stood there for a long moment looking at the window instead of the envelope. The Manhattan skyline blinked back at her, indifferent, enormous, doing what it always did, existing on a scale that made human catastrophe feel very small. Then she opened the envelope. By the time she reached the third paragraph, she had to sit down on the kitchen floor. $41 million. That was the number the plaintiff's attorneys had attached to the phrase estimated damages. $41 million that Marcus Holt, her partner of 11 years, her business school friend, the man who had stood beside her at every ribbon cutting and every pitch meeting and every 2 a.m. crisis, had apparently been siphoning out of client escrow accounts for the better part of 3 years. $41 million that Marcus had moved through a series of shell companies before boarding a flight to Singapore 14 days ago with $300,000 in cash, and what investigators described, in a separate document she'd received the previous week, as no apparent intention to return. The firm's accounts had been frozen. The bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings on the office lease. 3 clients had already filed independent lawsuits, and the fourth, a real estate development group named Ardent Capital, whose mixed-use tower project had consumed 2 years of Vivian's life, had issued a press release stating they were deeply troubled by the criminal conduct associated with Mercer and Holt Architecture and were re-evaluating all ongoing professional relationships. The press had picked it up by noon of the previous Friday. By Saturday morning, Vivian had received 47 texts from colleagues, 8 from former clients, and 2 from journalists. She had not responded to any of them. She'd sat in her apartment in the particular silence that follows complete destruction, the kind of silence that has texture and weight, and she'd read and reread the documents until the language stopped meaning anything and the numbers became abstract shapes on a page. She was 51 days away from the automatic bankruptcy filing her attorney had quietly warned her about during a phone call she'd taken in the parking garage of her building because she couldn't stand the idea of anyone overhearing it. 51 days. She sat on the kitchen floor with the letter in her hands until the sunlight moved across the counter and the cold coffee got colder and the skyline outside went from gray morning to flat afternoon white. And she thought about the 11 years she'd spent turning Mercer and Holt into something real. The Halcyon Tower, the Meridian Arts Center renovation, the Parkside Commons affordable housing project she'd pushed through 3 city planning committees on sheer stubbornness. She thought about the junior architects she'd hired straight out of graduate school, the ones who'd trusted her with the early years of their careers, who were now fielding calls from recruiters while their LinkedIn profiles quietly updated to say, formerly of. She thought about Marcus, his easy laugh, the way he always refilled her coffee before she asked, the framed photograph still sitting on her drafting table of the 2 of them at the Halcyon groundbreaking, hard hats slightly askew, grinning like people who'd earned something. She picked up the photograph and put it face down. Then she got up off the floor because staying on it wasn't going to accomplish anything, and she was, above all things, a woman who understood that problems were solved by getting up and working, not by sitting still inside them. The invitation arrived 4 days later. It came by private courier, not the standard kind, but a man in a dark coat who said nothing except her full name as a question when she opened the door, and when she confirmed it, handed her a matte black envelope and left without waiting for a signature. She stood in the doorway watching him get into a black SUV with tinted windows that she was fairly certain had been parked on her block for the last 2 days. Inside the envelope was a single card. Heavyweight stock, no letterhead. The handwriting was precise and slightly left-leaning, the penmanship of someone who'd learned to write in an era when it was still considered a discipline. Ms. Mercer, I have a proposition that may resolve your current difficulties. I would ask for 1 hour of your time. Thursday, 7 p.m. The Aldrich penthouse floor. My car will collect you at 6:45. D. Blackwood. She read it twice. Then she looked at the return envelope, which bore no address. Damian Blackwood. She knew the name. Everyone in New York knew the name, the way you knew the name of a storm system before it made landfall. Not because you'd studied it, but because you'd absorbed it through the atmosphere of a city that ran, in significant part, on his permission. He owned properties across 4 boroughs. He had interests in construction, port logistics, private security, and a dozen other verticals that were legal enough to appear in filings but threaded through with the kind of infrastructure that didn't survive too much public scrutiny. 3 years ago, a federal grand jury had convened to examine his operations. It had quietly disbanded 6 months later without indictment, which most people in New York's legal community took as either a testament to his innocence or a testament to something considerably more complicated. 2 years ago, he'd survived an assassination attempt. That part was public record. The shooting had occurred outside a restaurant in Midtown, broad daylight, 3 gunmen, 4 of his people wounded, and Damian Blackwood transported to Mount Sinai, where surgeons spent 6 hours in an operating room with him. The damage to his spine had been called catastrophic by the attending physician in a statement to the press. He had not died. He had not appeared in public for 4 months afterward, and when he did, it was in a wheelchair. And his expression in the one photograph that circulated was the same as a man who'd made a decision about something. He hadn't granted an interview since. He didn't attend public events. His name appeared in real estate transactions and corporate filings and the occasional federal court document listing him as a person of interest in things that never seemed to go anywhere. Vivian put the card down on her drafting table next to where the halcyon photograph used to be. Her attorney called at 9 the following morning. The news wasn't new so much as it was a sharper version of what she already knew. The bankruptcy timeline had compressed slightly, there was a creditors' meeting being scheduled, and the New York State Board of Architecture had opened a preliminary inquiry, which was not a disciplinary action yet, but was the step that preceded one. Her license was not in immediate jeopardy, but the word yet was doing significant work in that sentence. She hung up and sat with the black card in her hands. She was not a reckless woman. She had built her career on precision and patience and an almost pathological commitment to understanding what she was getting into before she stepped into it. She had walked away from 3 different firm partnerships in her 30s because the terms weren't right, even when the money would have been easier. She had read every clause of every contract she'd ever signed, sometimes twice, sometimes with a second attorney present. She was also a woman who, 51 days ago, had been 51 days from bankruptcy and was now 47 days from it, and whose options had narrowed to a width she could barely see through. She called the number written on the back of the card. It rang once. 7 o'clock, a man's voice said, calm and without inflection. The car will be at your address. She didn't know how he had her address. She assumed that was the point. I'll be ready, she said. The Aldrich was the kind of hotel that didn't advertise because it didn't need to. 38 floors of dark glass and limestone on the corner of 57th and Park, the sort of building that looked expensive without trying, because trying would have been gauche. She'd actually designed a proposed renovation of the lobby 4 years ago, a speculative pitch she'd submitted through a hospitality client that had gone nowhere, but she'd kept the drawings because she was proud of them. The elevator required a key card for the penthouse floor. The man who met her in the lobby, large, quiet, watching her the way people watch for exits, produced one without being asked and rode up with her without speaking. The elevator opened directly into a foyer, dark hardwood, low lighting, artwork on the walls that she recognized from auction catalogs. A woman appeared, offered to take her coat, and led her through a set of double doors into a room that was simultaneously the most intimidating and most carefully curated space Vivian had ever stood in. Damian Blackwood was at the window. She'd seen one photograph of him, the one from the day after the shooting, and she'd seen older images from before, charity events, a business profile in a real estate publication from 8 years ago, the grainy CCTV still that had circulated briefly during the federal investigation. In all of them, he had been standing, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with the kind of face that photographers described as severe, because they didn't know how else to frame something that wasn't handsome in any warm or approachable way, but was undeniably compelling. In the wheelchair, he was different, and he was the same. He sat with the posture of someone who'd decided that accommodation was not the same thing as concession. His suit was charcoal, his shirt was open at the collar, and there was a glass of something amber on the table beside him. He turned when she entered, and his eyes found her with the directness of a man who had long ago stopped wasting time on anything indirect. "Ms. Mercer," he said. His voice was the same one she'd heard on the phone, controlled. "Thank you for coming." "You didn't leave me much choice," she said. "There's always a choice. You made one." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down." She sat. The woman who'd taken her coat appeared silently with water and then disappeared again. Damian studied her the way she imagined he studied everything, thoroughly and without apology. She didn't look away. She'd spent her career in rooms full of men who used sustained eye contact as a power move, and she'd learned that the only answer was to give it back to them steadily until they recalibrated. He almost smiled. Not quite. But the line of his mouth shifted fractionally, and she got the impression he'd registered the small contest and filed it somewhere. "I'll be direct," he said. "I'd prefer that. Your firm is finished in its current form. You have 47 days before the automatic filing, and realistically less than 30 before the creditors' meeting makes any restructuring impossible. The State Board inquiry will likely result in a suspension of your license within 90 days, which will make it impossible to practice even if you somehow manage to restructure. Your former partner is in Singapore and intends to remain there." He said all of this without particular cruelty. The tone was the same tone you'd use to read an itemized list. "You've had 3 meetings with restructuring attorneys in the last 2 weeks. All 3 told you the same thing. The numbers don't work." She kept her expression even. "You've done your research." "I always do." "Then you know I didn't do anything wrong." "I know you didn't steal anything," he said. "Whether that's the same as not doing anything wrong is a question worth sitting with. You trusted someone you shouldn't have trusted, and you weren't watching the accounts closely enough. Those aren't crimes, but they have consequences." He picked up his glass, considered it, set it back down without drinking. "I'm not interested in your guilt or your innocence, Ms. Mercer. I'm interested in what you can build." "What I can build," she repeated. "Your Halcyon Tower project won 2 design awards before Ardent Capital froze the development. Your Meridian renovation brought in a historic preservation commendation. The Parkside Commons project, which you funded partially out of your own salary for 18 months when the city grant was delayed, is considered one of the better executed affordable housing projects completed in this city in the last decade." He said these things from memory without consulting anything. "You are a genuinely excellent architect. The city is worse for what's happening to you." "That's a kind thing to say." "I'm not a kind man." "No," she agreed. "You're not." Something moved behind his eyes, quick and unreadable. "I need a wife," he said. The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the hotel below them, she could feel the low vibration of the building, the mechanical life of it, the hum of a city that didn't stop for anyone. "I'm listening," she said, because it was the only thing to say. He told her. Precisely, methodically, without ornament. The Blackwood family's business holdings, the legitimate ones, the vast portfolio of real estate and logistics and private equity that had been built across 3 generations, were currently subject to a complex restructuring that required under the terms of certain older partnership agreements and trust instruments, the presence of a married primary shareholder. It was, he said, an archaic requirement, a relic of the kind of old money conservatism that didn't yield to modernity quickly, but it was legally binding, and the alternative was a restructuring timeline that would cost his organization something in the range of $200 million in penalties and forced liquidations. "The people who shot me," he said, and there was nothing in his voice when he said it, no flinch, no adjustment, just the same clean declarative, "are still operating. They're watching my business. Any sign of structural weakness, anything that reads as instability in my position, and they'll move again." The restructuring on its own would read as that kind of weakness. But a married man consolidating his assets reads differently. It reads as planning for the future, as stability. "So you need a wife to close a business deal and stay alive," Vivian said. "Essentially." "And what does your wife get?" He listed it the same way he'd listed her achievements. Specific, complete, nothing left to implication. Every debt cleared, personal, corporate, and legal. The firm restructured under a new name with fresh operating capital. The state board inquiry handled through his legal team, her license protected. A guaranteed 18-month period in which she could rebuild her practice with access to his network of construction clients and property developers. A generous monthly living allowance. Full use of his estate property in Westchester during the term of the agreement. 18 months, she said. 18 months. After which an amicable divorce, a settlement that allows you to continue operating independently, and a non-disclosure agreement that protects both of us. And during those 18 months, you live in the house. You attend necessary events. You're present for the legal and financial processes that require a spouse's signature or presence. He paused. "That's all." "That's all," she said. "This is a contract, Miss Mercer, not a romance." She looked at him. 52 years old, she knew from the profile she'd read on her phone in the car on the way over, though he read older in some ways and younger in others. There was something compressed about him, the way certain materials compressed under extreme pressure. Not weakened, the opposite of weakened, dense with it. The wheelchair didn't diminish him. If anything, it made the rest of him more present, the focus that radiated from his stillness more concentrated, because there was nothing else moving to distract from it. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't parse. Not calculating exactly, not cold, somewhere in between. "What happens if I fall in love with you?" she asked. She said it flatly, as a logistical question, not a hope. His jaw tightened, just slightly. "That's not in the contract." "I'm asking anyway." "Then I'd say you should be smarter than that." "And if you fall in love with me?" The silence stretched. A long car horn floated up from the street below. The building hummed. "That," he said, "is also not in the contract." She stood up. She walked to the window beside him and looked out at the city. The lights, the density of it, the 10,000 lit windows of 10,000 lives being lived without any awareness of this conversation, this room, these two people, and the wreckage between them. She thought about 47 days. She thought about the Parkside Commons project and the families who'd moved in and the kid she'd seen riding a bicycle in the courtyard the day of the ribbon cutting, weaving between the adults with the careless competence of a child who didn't know yet that spaces like that were fought for. She thought about Marcus Holt refilling her coffee and the gouge on the drafting table, and the 11 years she'd built into a thing that had then been hollowed out from the inside while she wasn't watching. "I'll want an attorney to review the contract," she said. "Of course." "My own attorney, not yours." "Naturally." "I'll want a clause guaranteeing my professional independence. Any project I take on during the 18 months is mine. My decisions, my design process, my name on the work." "Agreed." "And I'll want access to the relevant legal filings, the trust documents, the partnership agreements you mentioned. I don't sign things I don't understand." He regarded her for a moment. "You understand this could take some time to review." "Then we should start tonight," she said. He almost smiled again. This time it was close enough to be real, a thin slant of something at the corner of his mouth that might have been the first honest reaction she'd seen from him. He reached to the table beside him and pressed a small button on a discreet panel she hadn't noticed. The woman who'd taken her coat appeared. "Bring the documents," he said. They sat across from each other until nearly midnight. He answered every question she asked, directly, precisely, with the occasional clarification that suggested he'd anticipated the question. She asked about the enemies he'd described. He told her what he considered necessary and said there were things he wouldn't tell her, not because he was deceiving her, but because there were things that weren't safe for her to know until she'd made a decision. "How do you know I won't use what I learn about your business to protect myself?" she asked. "Go to law enforcement or the press." "Because you're not stupid," he said, "and you understand that those options don't restore anything you've lost. They just add to the destruction." "That's not a trust-based answer." "No, it's an incentive-based one." He met her eyes. "Which is the only kind that actually holds." She thought about that for a moment. Then she thought about something else. "The people who shot you," she said, "the ones who are still out there. If we do this, if I move into your house and attend these events and sign the documents, I become visible. I become attached to you, publicly, which means I become a target." He didn't look away. "Yes. You're telling me this. I told you I'd be direct. Most men in your position would have buried that information in the small print." "I don't do small print," he said. "You need to understand what you're agreeing to, not just the financial terms. If you sign this, you're not just entering a business arrangement. You're entering my world. People in my world get hurt sometimes. I will do everything in my power to prevent that, but I won't lie to you about the risk." The city pulsed below them. Vivian felt it in her chest, the frequency of it, the familiar pulse of a place that had eaten a dozen versions of her life and required her to build new ones out of whatever survived. "Send the contract to my attorney," she said. "I'll have comments back to you within 72 hours. He nodded. A single measured movement. She stood, retrieved her coat from the woman who materialized in the doorway, and walked toward the elevator. Her hand was on the button when his voice came across the room. "Ms. Mercer?" She turned. He was looking at her with something she couldn't name. Not warmth, not calculation, but some third thing that sat between them in the space between two people who'd just laid their most urgent problems on the same table and realized uneasily that they fit. "I build things too," he said, "in my way. I want you to know that." She pressed the button. The elevator doors opened. "I know," she said, and she stepped inside. Mom. The contract arrived the following morning, 212 pages, dense with legal architecture that her attorney, Rebecca Cho, spent the better part of 48 hours dissecting. Vivian sat across from Rebecca in her small office on the 14th floor of a midtown building and watched the attorney's expression cycle through skepticism, surprise, grudging respect, and something that kept landing on "this is unusual" before catching itself. "The financial terms are real," Rebecca said on the second day, setting down her pen. "I've had our forensic accountant look at the debt clearance structure. It's executable. He has the liquidity." "I know he has the liquidity," Vivian said. "And you know who he is." "Yes." "Vivian." "I know." Rebecca looked at her. They'd worked together for 9 years. She had seen Vivian at her most precisely reasonable and at her most exhausted, and she knew the difference. "The personal safety provisions are actually unusually strong," Rebecca said finally. "He's indemnifying you against harm resulting from his organizational activities, which is, I've never seen that language before. It's almost like he anticipated that you'd want it." "He anticipates things," Vivian said. "There's one clause I want you to look at." Rebecca pushed the document across the desk, opened to page 107, and pointed to a paragraph that had been flagged with a yellow tab. Vivian leaned in. The clause stated that in the event either party developed emotional attachment to the other during the term of the agreement, such attachment would constitute neither a breach of contract nor grounds for modification of any term. It further stated that no emotional claim, however genuine, would alter the legal termination date of the agreement or any of its stipulated terms. Vivian read it twice. "He put that in there," Rebecca said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Vivian said. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "That clause exists because he thought it might become relevant. Or because he's thorough. Vivian, that clause exists because he's already thinking about it." Vivian closed the document. Outside the office window, the city was doing what it always did, existing without her, moving without her, its scale placing all her complications in a context that was either humbling or clarifying, depending on the day. "I'm going to sign it," she said. Rebecca sat back. "Okay. Because I built something real, and I'm not going to let it disappear because one person I trusted turned out to be rotten." She said it quietly but cleanly, the way she said the things she'd already decided. And because $41 million and 44 days don't leave a lot of options. "And because of him?" Rebecca asked. "Not the money. Him." Vivian picked up her pen. She looked at the space on page 212 where her signature would go. "Ask me in 18 months, she said. She signed it on a Thursday, in Damian Blackwood's attorney's office, in the presence of 4 lawyers, a notary, and Damian himself, who sat across the conference table and signed his own copy with the same contained precision he seemed to apply to everything, and then looked up and met her eyes for a moment that lasted a breath longer than necessary. "Welcome to the arrangement, Miss Mercer," he said. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," she said. They did not shake hands. She moved into the estate 3 days later on a gray Saturday that couldn't decide between rain and not rain, the sky holding itself in that particular suspended tension. The estate was outside the city, 50 minutes in the car through the Westchester suburbs, and then past them into a pocket of land that felt deliberately removed from everything, a 9-acre property enclosed by a wall of old-growth oaks that absorbed sound and light in equal measure. The house itself stopped her. She had seen the exterior photographs in the documents, but photographs didn't prepare you for the specific quality of a building's presence, the way good architecture had a weight that you felt before you understood it. The estate had been built in the 1920s, expanded twice, and despite its size, 12,000 square feet across 3 floors, a guest wing, a carriage house that had been converted to a secondary structure, it did not sprawl. It organized itself. The lines were honest, the materials were original where they'd survived, and someone, at some point, had understood proportion. But it was dead inside. That was the word that arrived in her mind as she walked through the entrance hall for the first time, her footsteps flat against the stone floor, the staff moving quietly around her with her bags. Dead. The furniture was expensive and arranged correctly and entirely without life. The rooms were clean and cold and curated to a standard that had nothing to do with being lived in. The artwork on the walls was real and significant and hung with the attention of someone who'd been advised what to buy, and each piece sat in its frame like something waiting to be looked at rather than something that had been chosen with any particular feeling. The woman who managed the house, Mrs. Aldridge, compact, precise, who'd introduced herself in the foyer with the carefully calibrated warmth of someone who had trained herself to be neither warm nor cold, explained the schedule, the staff structure, the household systems, the security protocols, and the specific geography of the house as it related to Damian's routine and his requirement for privacy. His office wing was the east side of the ground floor. His private rooms were the second floor east. Those areas were not areas she would need to enter. "Mr. Blackwood keeps unusual hours," Mrs. Aldridge said. "I keep unusual hours too," Vivian said. "Yes, well." The woman looked at her with an expression that Vivian filed as "we'll see." "Your rooms are on the second floor west. There's a studio space prepared for your work in the north wing. Mr. Blackwood arranged it specifically." Vivian paused. "He arranged a studio?" "He asked me to prepare a drafting space, natural north light, which I understand is preferred for architectural work." She said it without elaboration, as if the information was simply logistical. Vivian looked at the east wing, down the long corridor, toward the closed door at the far end. She didn't see Damian until dinner, which was served in a dining room that was exactly the size dining rooms in houses like this were always unnecessarily large. The table capable of seating 18 with ease. He was already at the head of it when she arrived, a document in one hand, a glass of water beside him, dressed down from the night at the hotel. Dark sweater, nothing else visible under the table. He looked like a man who was working, which he was, and who had agreed to be interrupted by a meal, which was apparently all this was. He glanced up when she sat. "How are the rooms?" he asked. "Fine," she said. "Good. The light is, She stopped. How did you know about North Light? I read about it, he said, and looked back at his document. They ate in silence for most of the meal. The food was well made. A cook, Mrs. Aldridge had mentioned, someone who came in evenings, and the silence between them was not, she noticed, uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who were not performing anything for each other, who had agreed on terms and were simply existing inside them, which was, in its way, a kind of relief after weeks of managing everyone else's discomfort about her situation. The studio, she said, at some point between the main course and whatever followed it. Thank you. He looked up from the document. It's a practical provision. You need to work. The house has the space. It was a thoughtful, practical provision. He studied her for a moment with the expression she was learning to read, not suspicious exactly, but precise, like he was calibrating something. Don't make too much of it, he said. All right, she said. He looked back at his document. She looked at the room around her, the dead room, the perfect room, the room that had clearly been arranged by people who understood formal dining and understood nothing at all about eating. And she thought about what she would do with it if given 6 months and a reasonable budget. She thought about North Light. She thought about the clause on page 107. Outside, the almost rain finally decided, and she heard it begin against the tall windows, the first real sound the house had made since she arrived, the particular sound of water hitting glass in a structure large enough to have its own acoustic signature, and for a moment, against all reason, she felt something settle in her chest. Then her phone buzzed. She looked at it. It was an alert from the news service she'd set up to track mentions of her name. The headline read, Disgraced NYC. Architect Vivian Mercer marries crime boss. Sources confirm stunning alliance. The story had broken 6 hours earlier. It had been shared 40,000 times. She looked up from her phone. Across the table, Damien was watching her. It started, she said. His expression didn't change, but he set down the document, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he gave her his full, undivided attention. Yes, he said, it has. The story broke on a Sunday, which meant by Monday morning it had metastasized through every layer of the city's information ecosystem. The tabloids, the financial press, the architecture blogs, the crime beat reporters who'd been circling Damien Blackwood's name for years like birds around something they suspected was dead but weren't certain enough to land on. Vivian read 17 different versions of it before 7 in the morning, sitting in the North Studio with a cup of coffee going cold beside her drafting table. The pale gray light of an October dawn doing what it always did, arriving without ceremony, making everything look honest. The studio was good. She hadn't expected it to be good. Damien had given her a long, north-facing room on the 3rd floor of the main house with 2 walls of windows, original oak floors, and a ceiling height that made the space breathe. Someone had already installed a drafting table, a model building workbench, and a set of flat files. The flat files were empty. She'd spent the previous evening filling one drawer with the project sketches she'd brought from her apartment, the ones she'd kept from the period before everything collapsed, the drawings that still had the texture of real work in them. The articles ranged from breathless speculation to something approaching legitimate journalism, which meant someone had sources and someone was feeding them. The most detailed piece, published by a financial news outlet that usually covered hedge funds and had no business knowing anything about her personal life, included the phrase, "Sources close to Blackwood's organization confirmed the marriage as part of a broader restructuring of his business holdings," which meant someone inside the organization or someone adjacent to it had talked. She texted Damien, "Someone in your organization leaked the restructuring connection. Article cites internal sources." 3 minutes passed. Then, "I know, it's being handled." She stared at the message. Being handled. She did not ask what that meant, and she was not sure she wanted to know. By 9, Rebecca had called twice. By 10, a journalist from the Post had appeared at the estate gate, which she knew only because one of the security staff, a man named Torres, who had the quiet, compressed manner of someone who'd spent significant time in a formal tactical environment, came to the studio door and informed her of it with exactly the neutrality of someone reporting a weather condition. "What does Mr. Blackwood want done about it?" she asked. Mr. Blackwood's instructions are that you make no statements without prior coordination, Torres said. He'd like to see you when you're available. His office. Ground floor east. She'd been told the east wing was his. The instruction not to enter it had been implicit in Mrs. Aldridge's orientation, soft-edged but clear. She had for 3 days respected it. She put down her pencil and went. The office was not what she expected, which was becoming a pattern with this man. She'd anticipated something that matched the dining room, expensive, arranged, lifeless. Instead, it was a working space, genuinely worked in, with a large desk that was covered in documents in a way that suggested an active organizational system rather than disorder, a wall of reference volumes that had the looked-at quality of books that were actually used, and a secondary table along one wall spread with what she recognized, with some surprise, as architectural drawings. Not her work. Older plans, property surveys, structural drawings for what appeared to be the estate itself, and several other properties. Damien was behind the desk. He was on the phone when she entered, and he glanced up, held up one finger, and finished the call in 3 sentences that told her nothing except that whoever he was speaking to was going to do something more efficiently than they had been doing it. He set the phone down. "Sit down," he said. "Who talked?" she said, and didn't sit. He looked at her for a moment. Someone in the legal team made contact with a financial journalist he has an existing relationship with. The information shared was limited, but strategically damaging. Was it deliberate? Yes. So someone inside your organization wants the restructuring to look unstable, or wants the marriage to look like what it is, he said, which is a business arrangement, which undermines the purpose of the arrangement. She absorbed this. What happens to the person who talked? That's not your concern. It is my concern, she said. Because if there's someone in your organization actively working against this, I need to know the scope of it. I've just become the most visible part of your personal life. That makes me the most accessible pressure point. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that had weight. You're right, he said. I know I'm right. That's why I'm saying it. He leaned back in the wheelchair with the deliberate economy of a man who'd long since made peace with the mechanics of it, and he looked at her with an expression she was starting to identify as the one he wore when he was deciding how much to tell her. There are people within my business network, he said, who believe that the restructuring creates an opportunity for realignment of certain interests. They're not wrong that it creates a window. They're attempting to widen it. Who? A man named Carver Solis. He controls logistics operations in 3 boroughs. He's been patient about certain ambitions for a long time, and he views this period as his moment. And the people who shot you 2 years ago? Related interests, not identical. Damien. She used his first name without deciding to, and heard herself do it, and didn't retract it. I need you to stop managing what you tell me. I am inside this now. I signed the contract. I'm standing in your house with my name attached to yours in 17 news articles. You told me yourself the night we met that there were things you wouldn't tell me until I'd made a decision. I've made the decision. Tell me. The room held the sound of rain, still going, the same rain from the night before, persistent. He looked at her for a long time. Solis has people watching this property, he said. He's been watching it for 2 weeks. The leak to the journalist was almost certainly coordinated. It was designed to raise questions about whether this marriage is real enough to satisfy the trust instrument conditions. If the restructuring attorneys determine the marriage is a fiction, the trust provisions don't trigger. Solis moves into the vacancy. What makes a marriage real enough? She asked. Consistent public presence, shared life, photographs, events, testimony from people in our social orbit. He paused. Which means in the next several weeks, you and I need to be convincing. To who? To everyone who's watching, which is more people than you'd like. She stood in the middle of his office and thought about the 17 news articles and the journalist at the gate and the clause on page 107 and the North Studio with its empty flat files and its excellent light. I can be convincing, she said. I know you can, he said. That's not what concerns me. What concerns you? He looked at the window, the rain, some particular geometry of his thoughts that he didn't share. Nothing, he said. We have an event next Thursday, a dinner at the Brandt Gallery. It's the kind of room where being seen together matters. I'll have my people arrange the details. I'll need something to wear, she said. That's already arranged. Of course it is, she said, and left. Out. The weeks developed their own rhythm, which she hadn't anticipated. She had expected the house to stay dead around her, expected to exist inside it as a visitor, which was technically what she was. Instead, she found herself, by the third week, quietly, and without any formal announcement, making it less dead. It started with the entrance hall, which had a lighting problem, overhead fixtures that cast downward, cold and institutional, instead of drawing the eye to the original crown molding and the honest quality of the stone floor. She mentioned it to Mrs. Aldridge, not as a request, but as an observation, framed professionally, the way she'd frame a note on a client's property. Mrs. Aldridge had looked at her with the expression of someone who did not know yet how to file her. 2 days later, she found a note on her drafting table in that precise, left-leaning handwriting. Mrs. Aldridge says you have thoughts about the lighting. Do what you think is appropriate. No signature, but the handwriting needed no signature. She sourced warm spectrum fixtures and had them installed in 3 days. The entrance hall changed character the way rooms changed character when you corrected their fundamental misunderstanding of themselves. Suddenly, the stone had warmth, and the molding had shadow, and the space felt like the beginning of something rather than a corridor to somewhere else. She didn't mention it to him. He didn't mention it to her. But at dinner one evening, 2 days later, she caught him looking at the hallway through the open dining room door with an expression she couldn't read. And when he turned back to the table, there was something fractionally different in the set of his face. They ate dinner together most evenings. It had evolved without being decided. He worked late and she worked late, and the cook left food, and at some point they had both arrived at the dining room at the same hour enough times that it became, unremarkably, what happened. They talked about the house. They talked about her projects. He asked precise questions about architectural process. Not small talk questions, but genuine ones, the kind that built on each other, that suggested he was retaining what she told him and using it. He did not talk about his business unless she pushed. When she pushed, he answered as far as he thought he should, and then stopped in a way that was clean rather than evasive. It was the discipline of a man who had spent decades managing exactly what he revealed, and to whom. And she recognized it the way she recognized the habits of someone who had survived something severe. The economy of it, the practiced efficiency of a person who had learned that certain kinds of openness cost more than they returned. She was pushing a loose thread on a hem one night, thinking about the Ardent Capital project, specifically about the structural drawings she'd been reconstructing from memory, rebuilding the tower proposal because she couldn't stand the incompleteness of having it unfinished, even now, even knowing they'd never return to it, when she heard the sound from the east wing. She'd heard it before, twice, at night, the specific sound of something physical and contained, not furniture, not machinery, and hadn't identified it. This time it went on longer, and she was closer, in the upstairs hallway rather than in her room, and after a moment she understood it was pain. Not loud. That was the thing about it. The sound was not loud. It was the sound of a man experiencing something severe and refusing to give it more volume than it absolutely required, which was a specific kind of discipline that she recognized as well, though she'd never had occasion to exercise it to that degree. She stood in the hallway for a moment, her hand near the door to the east wing. She did not open it. She went back to her room and lay in the dark for 40 minutes, and thought about the afternoon 2 years ago when the shooting had been reported, the medical statements that had used words like catastrophic and permanent, and she thought about what it cost a man like Damian Blackwood, a man whose entire identity had been organized around a particular quality of physical authority, to navigate a world that had taken that from him, and she thought about him doing it alone, in a house this size, with staff who were paid to be professionally invisible. In the morning at breakfast, he was at the kitchen table with coffee and a document when she came down, and he looked exactly as he always looked, contained, precise, present, and nothing in his face or manner acknowledged the previous night. She poured her coffee. She sat across from him. "I want to look at the guest wing," she said. He looked up. "Why?" "Because it's structurally interesting and someone has been ignoring it for at least 15 years and I want to see what's there." Something crossed his face, too quick to catch. "It's not in use." "I know, that's the point." A pause. He went back to his document. Do what you want, he said. She explored the guest wing that afternoon and found, as she'd suspected from the exterior, that it had a load-bearing problem on the west side that would eventually become structural. And she also found, more unexpectedly, a room on the second floor that someone had begun converting into something. Cleared of furniture, pencil marks on one wall at measured intervals, a single architectural plan pinned to a makeshift board, and never finished. She studied the plan for a long time. It was amateur work, imprecise, but it had the quality of someone who understood space and was working to learn the language for what they felt about it. She left the room without touching anything. At dinner, she said, "There's a room in the guest wing with plans pinned to the wall." He was very still for a moment. "Old project," he said. "What was it going to be?" "A library." He set down his fork. "Before the shooting, He stopped, started again. "The west side of the guest wing has the best afternoon light in the house. I had ideas about the space. I don't—" He looked at the table. It wasn't serious. "It looked serious," she said. "The proportions were right. The measurements were careful." He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before, which was something stripped of the usual precision, something without its habitual management. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. "Because it's a good room," she said, "and because you shouldn't leave good rooms empty." He picked up his fork. He didn't answer. But for the rest of dinner, he was quieter than usual, and the quality of his quiet was different. Less controlled, more interior. The Brandt Gallery dinner arrived on a Thursday, the way important evenings always arrived, with a cold efficiency that made all the preparation feel retroactively inadequate. The dress that had been arranged was good, she had to admit. Charcoal silk with enough structure to read as serious in a room full of people who would be assessing her. She stood in front of the mirror in her room and thought about performance, about what it meant to perform a marriage she didn't have with a man she was beginning to understand more than she'd planned to. Damien was waiting in the entrance hall when she came down. He was in a dark suit, which should have been unremarkable, and his expression was its usual self, which should have been too. But he looked at her when she reached the bottom of the stairs with an attention that was different from his usual precise assessment, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "You look good," he said. It came out flat, undecorated, which somehow made it more real than if he'd dressed it up. "You too," she said. They went out to the car. The gallery was crowded with the specific density of a New York money event, the kind of room where everyone was either connected to power or performing proximity to it, where conversations happen in the space between looking at artwork and looking at who else was in the room. She recognized faces. Some of them were architectural clients, former or current. Some of them were the kind of civic figures that moved between legitimate business and the other kind. Some of them watched Damien with the particular attention of people who tracked his position the way sailors tracked weather. She stayed beside him. That was the agreement, the implicit one, visible, present, consistent. He moved through the room with the authority of a man who understood that a wheelchair changed nothing about how rooms responded to him if he didn't let it, and rooms responded to him like something redistributing weight. Conversations angled toward him and then readjusted. She talked about architecture when she was asked. She talked about the Parkside Commons project, about her plans for restructuring her practice. And she said we in the places where it was plausible, naturally, without flagging it, and she felt Damien register it each time with a micro-adjustment in his posture that might have been approval. A man named Fletcher Voss introduced himself at the midpoint of the evening. Early 50s, too tan, the smile of someone who'd decided decades ago that charm was a resource to be allocated strategically. He was in development, legitimate development, the kind that required organized crime infrastructure and preferred not to say so. And he shook Vivian's hand and looked at her with the specific assessment of a man measuring a woman's usefulness rather than herself. "Vivian Mercer," he said, "I know your work. Halcyon Tower, beautiful project." "Thank you," she said. "Shame about Holt." His eyes went to Damien and back, the movement of it deliberate. "You've certainly, landed on your feet." Damien's hand moved to the armrest of his wheelchair with a controlled precision that Vivian recognized, in her peripheral vision, as restraint. I don't know that I'd call it landing, she said. Her voice was easy. Her smile was easy. Everything visible was easy. More like a very deliberate next chapter. Mercer Architecture is already in pre-production on 2 projects. I expect we'll announce both before the year's out. We? Voss said, and his smile sharpened. Damien has 3 development properties that haven't broken ground. I've been doing preliminary designs. This was partially true. She'd looked at the survey drawings on his office table and had, on her own time, begun thinking about them. It wasn't a lie so much as an acceleration of something real. He has strong ideas about what the spaces should do. Voss looked at Damien. Damien looked back at him with the absolute blankness of a man who had decided not to give anything away. Is that right? Voss said. Not a question. It is, Damien said. 1 word. The conversation ended shortly after that, Voss moving away through the crowd with his strategic smile recalibrated for whatever he'd gathered from the exchange. Vivian watched him go. The 3 development properties, Damien said quietly beside her. You have them. I've seen the surveys. I haven't looked at them seriously yet. The survey drawings were on my private work table. Your office door was open, she said. I'm an architect. I looked. A pause. She felt him looking at the side of her face. You handled Voss well, he said. He was easy, she said. He thinks women answer to the men they're with. It made him predictable. Not all of the men in this room think that way. No, she said. Which ones should I watch? He tilted his head almost imperceptibly toward the left side of the room, where a man was standing near a sculpture with a glass of wine and an expression of studied neutrality. Carver Solis, he said. Quiet, just for her. She didn't turn. She waited 3 seconds, then turned as if naturally surveying the room, and let her gaze pass over him without stopping. Solis was not what she'd imagined. Not physically imposing, not visibly hard. He was medium height, neat, with the face of a man who spent considerable effort being unmemorable. He was watching them with the patience of something that had decided on its direction and was simply waiting for the right moment. And then he looked directly at her, across the room, through the crowd, with a steadiness that said he'd already been watching and had decided she should know it. She looked away. He's not afraid of you, she said to Damien. No. That's the problem, isn't it? One of them. They left the gallery at 10:30. The car took them north through the city in the particular silence of 2 people processing the same evening from different angles. She watched the lights move past the window and thought about Solis's face and the quality of his stillness, and the fact that a man like that, patient and unmemorable and watching, was a specific kind of threat. Not the explosive kind, the grinding kind, the kind that wore things down. She thought about someone inside the organization leaking to the press. She thought about what being handled meant when Damien used it. She thought about the room in the guest wing with the unfinished plans, and the sound through the east wing door, and the clause on page 107. The car pulled through the estate gates. The oaks closed around them. I want to start on those development properties, she said, before they reached the house. Damien turned his head toward her in the dark. Why? Because Voss is going to repeat that conversation to Solis within 24 hours. And if there are no actual drawings, no actual project timelines, it reads as theater. But if there are real drawings, real design development, if your organization is genuinely moving forward on construction, then this reads as a functioning partnership, not a performance. She paused. And because they're interesting properties. I looked at the surveys. The lot in Red Hook has extraordinary potential. He watched her for a moment. You're thinking about the architecture, he said. Not just the cover. Both, she said. At the same time. Is that a problem? He turned back to the window. The house came into view, lit against the dark tree line, and she saw it the way she'd started seeing all buildings. As something that could be read, that told you things if you looked at it correctly, that had a story underneath its surface if you knew what to look for. No, he said, it's not a problem. They went inside. Mrs. Aldridge had left lights on in the entrance hall, the new warm lights. And the stone floor held the color differently than it had 3 weeks ago, honestly, like it was meant to. And for a moment they both stood in it, and neither of them said anything. "Good night, Damien," she said. "Good night," he said. She was halfway up the stairs when his voice came up after her, quieter than usual, with something in it that he probably hadn't fully decided to put there. "The room in the guest wing," he said. She stopped, turned. He was looking up at her from the entrance hall, one hand on the wheel of his chair, the warm light doing something to his face that the cold overhead fixtures never would have. "If you wanted to look at it again," he said, with fresh eyes, "I wouldn't object." She stood on the stairs and held the railing and felt something that the contract on page 107 had anticipated, and neither of them was ready to name. "I'll look at it tomorrow," she said. She went upstairs, she went to her room, she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and put her hands flat on her knees and breathed. Her phone lit up, a message from a number she didn't recognize, no contact name. 4 words only, "You should leave now." She read the message 4 times. "You should leave now." The phone screen dimmed and went dark, and the room went with it, just the faint ambient light from the grounds coming through the curtains, the security lights that never went fully off, and she sat on the edge of the bed with the phone in both hands and felt her pulse in her throat doing something she didn't like. She thought about Torres. She thought about Solace across the gallery room, the patience in his face, the quality of his stillness. She thought about the word now. Not soon, not consider leaving, but now, which was a specific kind of urgency, the kind that didn't leave room for consideration. She got up. She went to the window and looked out at the grounds without turning on a light, keeping herself back from the glass the way she'd heard you were supposed to, not knowing until this moment that she'd absorbed that information somewhere, that her body knew to do it. The driveway was dark. The tree line was dark. One of Torres's people moved along the perimeter of the east garden, a slow circuit, hands relaxed, nothing visible in his posture that suggested alarm. She went back to her phone and typed a response to the unknown number. "Who is this?" 3 minutes. 5. The message sat on read and no response came. She went to her door, opened it, and listened to the house. The house was quiet in the way large houses were quiet at night. Not silent, but breathing. The tick of cooling material, the low mechanical hum of climate systems, something that might have been wind against the west-facing windows. The east wing corridor was dark. No light under Damien's door. She almost knocked. She stood in the hallway with her hand raised and thought about what she would say. "I got a threatening text." And thought about his face, the precision of it, the way he'd managed every piece of information she'd been given access to so carefully. And she thought, he'll ask who sent it, and I don't know, and then he'll say it's being handled, and she'd be back in the same position she'd been in before, which was the position of a woman who had signed a contract and was now living inside the consequences of it without fully understanding the architecture of the threat. She went back to her room. She locked the door, not because it would stop anything serious, but because it made her feel like she'd made a decision. And she sat at the small desk by the window and opened her laptop and began working on the Red Hook survey drawings, because it was either that or sit in the dark with a message she couldn't trace, and she had never once solved a problem by sitting still inside it. She worked until 3 in the morning. The Red Hook lot had a water-facing orientation that was being completely ignored by the existing survey approach, and she kept reconstructing the site angles, looking for the line of sight to the harbor that was there if you positioned the structure correctly. She got absorbed in it the way she always got absorbed in site problems, the specificity of it pulling her down into the work until the text message was in the background of her attention rather than the foreground, and when she finally stopped, her neck was stiff, and the security lights outside were doing the particular thing they did just before dawn, casting the grounds in a blue-gray that wasn't yet day. She slept for 3 hours. She was already in the studio when Damien's household woke up. She didn't mention the text at breakfast. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment, the right framing, that she needed more information before bringing it to him. She told herself these things while watching him read a document across the kitchen table and knowing, at some level, that she was not ready to examine that she was protecting something. Not him, not herself, something less defined than either. The texture of what they had, which wasn't yet a word. She was protecting a thing she didn't have a name for. Rebecca called at 9:15. "I need you to come in," Rebecca said. There was something in her voice that was careful in the specific way that lawyers' voices got careful when the news was not good and they needed to deliver it on their own terms. "What happened?" "Come in, Vivian." "Rebecca, what happened?" A pause, just a beat. "The Ardent Capital suit has developed a new dimension. Their attorneys filed a supplemental complaint yesterday afternoon. I've been reading it since 6 this morning." Another pause. "It names you individually, not the firm. You. For what?" "Fraud. Knowing participation in the embezzlement scheme." The kitchen was suddenly very loud in its silence. She was aware of the coffee mug in her hand, the specific weight of it, the warmth. "That's not true," she said. "I know it's not true." "Rebecca, I know. Come in." She drove in herself, not using the estate car, not asking Torres or anyone else. She needed the 40 minutes in the car to be alone with the information, which she did not process so much as hold at arm's length while she drove, keeping her eyes on the highway and her hands on the wheel and her breathing deliberate. The way you breathed when the alternative was something she was not prepared to do on a Tuesday morning on the Sawmill River Parkway. The supplemental complaint was 47 pages. Rebecca walked her through the structure of it, which was this. Ardent Capital's attorneys had obtained communications, emails, internal documents, which they claimed demonstrated that Vivian had been aware of Holt's financial diversions for a period of at least 8 months before the scheme's discovery, and had taken no action because she was personally benefiting from undisclosed consulting fees paid through one of Holt's shell companies. She read the email they cited as primary evidence. Her name was on it. Her email address. The language was professional and specific and discussed in language she recognized as similar to her own professional register, the management of a particular client account in terms that, read without context, sounded like complicity. She had never written that email. She was absolutely certain she had never written that email. "It's fabricated," she said. "Yes," Rebecca said. "I believe you. But proving fabrication requires establishing that your email account was compromised, which requires forensic analysis, which requires time, which—" Rebecca set down her pen. "The filing is also timed. They submitted it the morning after your appearance at the Brandt Gallery, the day the press coverage of your marriage to Blackwood hit its second wave." Vivian looked at the page. The email. Her name on a document she'd never produced. "Someone waited," she said. "Someone waited until your name was maximally visible and then dropped this." "Yes." Rebecca looked at her steadily. "Someone who had access to your professional email infrastructure. Someone who could create a document that would survive initial scrutiny." "Marcus?" she said. "Possibly. Or someone working with Marcus. Or someone who has been planning this since before Marcus disappeared and used his departure as the triggering mechanism." She thought about Solis. She thought about the text message she hadn't mentioned to anyone. She thought about Damien sitting across the conference table the day she'd signed the contract, the precise way he'd looked at her, the careful architecture of everything he'd told her and everything he'd withheld. "Rebecca," she said, "is it possible this was always the plan? The fraud allegation, the fabricated evidence, the timing against the marriage announcement. Is it possible someone knew I would end up connected to Blackwood and designed this to land at exactly this moment?" Rebecca was very still. "Why would someone design that?" she said quietly. "To destroy the marriage's credibility, to make it look like I'm not just a business partner's wife, but an active criminal, to give Damien a reason to cut me loose, or to give the trust instrument attorneys a reason to void the arrangement." She heard herself laying it out and felt the shape of it lock into place with the particular click of a thing that had been true for a while and was only now being recognized. If I'm indicted, even charged, the restructuring falls apart. The marriage is a liability rather than an asset. Damien has to choose between protecting the business and protecting me. Rebecca looked at her hands on the desk. "That's a sophisticated operation," she said. "Yes," Vivian said. "It is." She drove back to the estate in a different state than she'd driven out of it. The 40 minutes on the highway were not the same 40 minutes. She thought about the 8 months of fabricated email threads. She thought about the person or people who had spent those months constructing a document that looked like her language, her professional register, her name. And she felt something that was not quite fear and not quite anger, but sat between them in a place that was very cold and very clear. She went directly to Damien's office. He was on the phone. She opened the door without knocking, which she had never done before, and he looked up from the desk with an expression that shifted rapidly through surprise into assessment. She sat down in the chair across from him. She waited. He finished the call in 2 sentences again and set the phone down. "You went to the city," he said, "without telling anyone." "I got a text message last night," she said. "Unknown number. 4 words. You should leave now." His jaw tightened. It was the only visible response, but on his face it registered the way significant movement registered on a seismograph. Small signal, large meaning. "And this morning," she continued, "Ardent Capital filed a supplemental complaint naming me individually for fraud, with fabricated email evidence that was designed to look like my work, filed the morning after the Brandt Gallery, after the second wave of press coverage." She put her hands flat on his desk. "Someone has been building this for 8 months. Someone who had access to my firm's email infrastructure, who knew I would end up connected to you, and who timed the filing to land at the exact moment when it would do the most damage to your restructuring." Damien said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then, "Solis, tell me everything," she said. "Right now. Not the version you decided was safe for me to know. Everything." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face, a decision being made at a speed she couldn't follow. "Close the door," he said. She got up and closed it. He told her. It took 40 minutes, and it was the most consecutive words she'd heard from him in the 8 weeks she'd lived in his house, and it was nothing like anything she'd been prepared for. Carver Solis had not been simply a rival organization operating independently. For the previous 3 years, Solis had been systematically positioning himself to absorb the Blackwood organization's legitimate holdings by engineering their structural collapse. The shooting 2 years ago had been his, which Damien had suspected and now had confirmation of, the kind that could not be used in any formal proceeding but was real. Solis had identified the trust instrument weakness, the married shareholder requirement, 18 months before Damien had moved to address it. He had also, through a network of intermediaries, been in contact with Marcus Holt. She heard that sentence and something went very quiet inside her. "Say that again," she said. "Solis's people made contact with Holt approximately 2 years ago," Damien said, and his voice was even, which she understood now was the voice he used when he was telling you something that cost him something, when the discipline of evenness was load-bearing. "We believe the embezzlement scheme was partly engineered, that Holt was encouraged and facilitated in exchange for the digital access to your firm's systems that allowed the fabricated email evidence to be constructed." "Marcus was working with Solis," she said. "We believe so. For 2 years. Approximately." She sat with this. She sat with the weight of it, which was enormous and kept arriving in new configurations. Marcus refilling her coffee, Marcus at the groundbreaking with his hard hat askew, Marcus's easy laugh and his 2 years of calculated performance, and the fabricated emails that used her language because he knew her language, because he'd sat across from her for 11 years and absorbed it. "He didn't just steal from the firm," she said. "No. He set me up. He built me into the exit strategy for your organization. The deal with Solis probably guaranteed him the Singapore money and immunity from—" She stopped. "Did he know? When he made the deal with Solis, did he know it would end with me standing in this house?" Damien's expression did something she hadn't seen it do before. It broke, not catastrophically, just at the edges, just enough to see through. "I don't know," he said. "I think the specifics evolved. I think initially you were collateral. I think later—" He stopped. "Later I was useful," she said. "I was the mechanism. Vulnerable enough to accept an arrangement with you, credible enough to make the marriage convincing, and now exposed enough that you have to choose between me and the business." He didn't say anything. "That's the move," she said. "That's the whole move. Either you keep me and the criminal fraud charge makes the marriage a liability, and destroys the restructuring, or you cut me loose and the marriage falls apart and the trust instrument isn't satisfied and Solis moves in. She looked at him. He wins either way. Unless we remove the choice, Damien said. How? The fabricated evidence has to be exposed as fabricated before the complaint proceeds, which requires the forensic work on your email systems, which requires access to the servers at the old firm office, she said, which were seized, which can be accessed through a specific federal proceeding if we have grounds. He held her gaze. There is a federal contact, someone I've worked with carefully, over time, in a way that required significant discretion on both sides. He's been building a case against Solis for 18 months. The evidence of Solis's involvement in your firm's compromise is exactly the kind of material he needs. You want me to talk to a federal agent? She said. I want to ask if you're willing to. She looked at the man across the desk, the wheelchair, the 40 minutes of information that had been waiting behind the precise management of what she was allowed to know. The library room in the guest wing with its unfinished plans, the text on page 107. There's something you haven't told me, she said. Still, he was quiet. Damien. The contact I have, he said slowly. The federal agent. The information I've been providing him in exchange for his assistance with Solis, it involves testimony about my own organization's past activities. He said it without looking away from her. If this proceeds, I will be cooperating with a federal investigation, not as a target, as a participant, which will require certain disclosures that will change the nature of the business permanently. She understood. You'd be turning evidence on yourself, on certain activities, from before. His voice stayed even, but something underneath it was not. The restructuring I told you about, moving to legitimate operations. I've been moving in that direction for 3 years. This would accelerate it, formalize it. There would be things I couldn't take back. But Solis goes down. Solis goes down. She thought about the Parkside Commons project and the families and the kid on the bicycle and 11 years of work and Marcus's easy laugh and a fabricated email that used her language to dismantle her life. And she thought about this man across the desk who had told her he wasn't kind and had prepared a studio with north light and had a room he'd never finished because something had happened to him that made finishing feel like too much to ask. Set up the meeting, she said. Vivian, set it up. He looked at her. The edges of his expression were still open in that way she'd only seen once, and it cost her something to look at it directly, the vulnerability of it, the thing underneath the precision that had no name in the contract and no place in their arrangement, and was sitting between them now like a third person in the room. You understand what you're walking into, he said. I've been walking into it since I signed the contract. She stood up. Maybe since before that. She moved toward the door. The text message, he said behind her. Last night. She stopped. That was my message, he said. I sent it from a clean number because I didn't... He stopped. I didn't know how to say it directly. She turned around slowly. He was looking at his hands on the desk, which was the first time she'd seen him look anywhere other than directly at her when he was saying something that mattered. You wanted me to leave, she said. I wanted you to be safe. He looked up. It's not the same thing. I told myself it was the same thing. It isn't. The room was very still. I know the difference, she said, between safety and leaving. Vivian. Her name in his mouth, stripped of formality, just the sound of it. I did not anticipate you. She stood in the doorway of his office in the house that was becoming something neither of them had contracted for, and she felt the page 107 claws pressing against the inside of her chest from the other direction, pushing outward now instead of holding anything in. Neither did I, she said, and left. She was in the studio at 4 a.m, the Red Hook drawing spread across the table, when Torres came through the door without knocking. His face was the face of a man delivering information he would prefer not to be delivering. We have a problem, Torres said. What kind? The charity gala tomorrow night. The one at the Sinclair Foundation. He held his phone out to her. On the screen was a security report, dense with coordinates and communication intercepts that she couldn't fully parse, but whose summary paragraph she could read clearly enough. Solis was going to be there. So were representatives of the 3 other families who'd been circling Blackwood's organization. And someone, Torres said the intelligence was solid, had been planning something that was not a conversation. Damien doesn't know yet, she said. I'm telling you first, Torres said. And the fact of that Torres had come to her first, told her something about how the house had shifted, about where the weight of the thing had settled in the weeks she'd been inside it. Tell him, she said, and tell him I'm going. Torres looked at her. To the gala, she said. Tell him I'm going. Ms. Mercer, tell him. Torres left. She turned back to the Red Hook drawings and stood over them without seeing them and breathed in and out, slow and deliberate, and felt the cold clarity of a person who had run out of room to move backward and was therefore going to have to move forward, straight into the thing that was coming. And she understood, standing in the North Studio in the 4 o'clock dark, that she was not the same woman who had sat on a kitchen floor 51 days ago reading a letter. She didn't know yet if that was enough. Part 4. The Sinclair Foundation Gala occupied the top 3 floors of a converted industrial building in Tribeca, the kind of repurposed space that the city's money class had decided represented an enlightened relationship with the past, exposed brick and reclaimed timber and a catering staff in minimalist black moving through rooms that had once processed something unglamorous and now processed the same thing in a different form. Vivian dressed alone. The gown was midnight blue, chosen by no one, pulled from the estate's arrangement with a designer whose name she didn't need to know. She did her own hair, her own makeup, with the efficiency of a woman who had never had time to make these things complicated, and she looked at herself in the mirror and thought, this is what you look like when you've decided. She and Damien had not spoken at length since the previous night. He had received Torres's report, and she knew this because Torres had confirmed it, and she knew Damien's response had been to attempt to have her removed from the guest list, which Torres had also confirmed, and which she had countermanded through her own contact with the event organizer, a woman named Dana Cho, who'd been a client of the firm's and owed Vivian a professional courtesy she was now collecting. Damien was waiting in the entrance hall when she came down. He looked at her coming down the stairs with an expression that passed through several things rapidly: fury, assessment, something that was not either, and settled on the discipline of a man who had decided his next sentence before she reached the bottom step. This is not what we discussed, he said. We didn't discuss it, she said. You tried to remove me from the list without telling me. I read the intelligence report Torres showed me. She picked up her coat from the chair where she'd left it. Solis is going to be there, which means every family that's been watching your position will be there. And if I don't appear, she turned to face him. If I disappear from public view the night after a fraud complaint is filed naming me, it reads as an admission. It reads as exactly what Solis needs it to read as. He was looking at her with the specific quality of attention that she'd come to understand meant he was revising something. You're right, he said. The same 2 words he'd said to her weeks ago in this office, and they landed the same way. Not a concession, a recalibration. But you're going to do exactly what I say when we're in that room. I'll do what makes sense when we're in that room, she said, which is what I always do. The muscle in his jaw moved. He didn't argue. The car took them south, and they sat in the back with 6 inches of seat between them that felt like the most charged geography in the city. She looked at the passing lights. He looked at his phone and then put it away, and she felt him looking at her profile in the dark. Vivian, she turned. If something happens tonight... He stopped. Started differently. Whatever happens, the firm documents are filed. The restructuring protection for Mercer Architecture is already in the trust instrument, regardless of the marriage status. You should know that. She looked at him. Why are you telling me that now? Because I should have told you 3 weeks ago and I didn't. His voice had lost the practiced evenness, just slightly, just enough to hear the thing underneath it. Because I want you to know that what I built for you isn't contingent on tonight. She felt something move through her chest, fast and unwelcome in its precision. "Stop doing that," she said. "What?" "Saying things that matter in a car on the way to something dangerous. It's terrible timing." Something crossed his face that she'd never seen there. Something quick and almost painful. The flash of a man who was fighting with his own expression and not entirely winning. "I know," he said. They arrived. The building's entrance was a managed crowd. Press, photographers, the quiet logistics of security that looked like hospitality if you didn't know what you were looking at. She stepped out of the car into the cold October air and felt the cameras before she saw them, the flare of it, the sudden sharpening of the world's attention. She put her hand on Damien's shoulder. Not his arm, his shoulder, higher than you'd place it for support. The placement of a woman who was present, deliberate, choosing, and they went inside. The room was everything the intelligence report had described, and also a room which was different, which had the actual density of bodies and sound, and the specific energy of 200 people performing for each other with real stakes underneath the performance. She felt it on her skin. She felt Damien feel it. A micro shift in his posture, the way a man who'd spent his life reading rooms read this one and found what he'd expected. Solis was on the far side of the room, near the bar, with two men she didn't know and one she'd seen at the gallery. Fletcher Voss, his strategic smile in full operation, talking to Solis with the relaxed demeanor of someone who'd decided which direction the wind was going. And across from the bar, near the windows, stood a woman Vivian didn't recognize, which was notable because she was the kind of woman you noticed. Late 40s, steel-haired, watching the room with the quality of attention that belonged to either someone in federal law enforcement or someone who ran things that were adjacent to it. She felt Damien see the woman at the same moment she did. "That's her," he said, very quiet. "The contact. She wasn't supposed to be visible tonight." "Why is she visible?" "Because something accelerated," he said, and his voice was taut now in a way she hadn't heard before. "Stay close." She stayed close. They moved through the room, and people spoke to them, and she answered with the automatic precision of a woman operating on two levels simultaneously, the surface performance and the deep attention that was tracking Solis, tracking the federal contact, tracking the two men she didn't know who had positioned themselves near the main exit in a way that was not subtle if you knew what not subtle looked like. She knew what it looked like now. She'd learned it in 8 weeks. A man she didn't recognize approached them near the center of the room. Late 30s, tall, with the contained movement of someone who was performing relaxation and not quite achieving it. He shook Damien's hand. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, "my employer asked me to pass along his regards." "Your employer," Damien said. His voice was completely flat. "Mr. Solis wanted you to know that he has tremendous respect for the way you've managed your current transition." The word landed like something dropped from a height. "He also wanted you to know that he's aware of certain documentation that was recently filed in connection with your wife's legal situation." The man's eyes moved to Vivian, polite, careful, the politeness of a knife held correctly. "He believes this is a complication that doesn't need to define the next chapter of your business relationship. If you were open to a conversation about structural realignment, he believes a mutually beneficial arrangement could be reached that would make certain evidentiary complications disappear." The room continued around them. Someone laughed, somewhere to the left. A waiter moved past with champagne. Damien said nothing for 3 seconds. "Tell Mr. Solis that I don't have business relationships with people who put bullets in my spine." The man's expression didn't change. Mr. Solis anticipated that response. "He asked me to remind you that you're currently in a room with a number of interested parties, and that the situation as it stands benefits no one, including—" Again, the careful look at Vivian, "Mrs. Blackwood." "That sounds like a threat," Vivian said. The man looked at her with slight surprise, the surprise of someone who hadn't expected the secondary target to speak. "It's an observation," he said. "It's a threat wrapped in real estate language." She held his gaze. "I'm an architect. I know what things look like when the structure isn't what the surface suggests." She let a beat pass. "Tell Mr. Solis his offer has been received. Tell him we'll be in touch." The man nodded and withdrew. Damien turned to look at her. Why did you say that? He said, very quiet. We'll be in touch. Because it buys time, she said, and because Solis's people are watching us right now, and the worst thing we can do is look rattled. She turned to face the room as if they were simply continuing to enjoy the event. How long until your contact can move? She needs something from me, directly, tonight, in a form that can be submitted to the proceeding by morning. A statement. A specific statement about a specific event. He paused. About the shooting, names, sequence, chain of instruction. I've never put it in writing. Once I do, you can't take it back. No. She looked at the room, at Solis near the bar, who was watching them with his unmemorable face and his patient eyes. At Fletcher Voss, who had moved slightly and was now angled toward Solis and not trying to hide it. At the two men near the exit who were still there. At the steel-haired federal contact by the windows, who was looking at Damien with the expression of someone who was waiting for a decision that only he could make. Damien, she said. Yes. The night in the gallery, you said you had something to tell me. You said something had changed. You were going to say it, and then Solis's man came over and you didn't. A long moment. The room moved around them. I was going to tell you, he said carefully, that the 18 months was a number I chose because it seemed sufficient for the legal purposes. He stopped. I was wrong about what it was sufficient for. She absorbed this. Say what you mean, she said. I mean that He stopped. The discipline was working against him now, the precision of a man who'd controlled every disclosure for decades trying to form something that didn't fit that framework. I mean that I am not indifferent to you. I have not been indifferent to you for some time, and I have been, his jaw tightened, aware that the contract did not provide for that, and I chose to stay in the contract, she said. Yes, because it was safer. Because I thought you deserved the option to leave cleanly, at the end, without, he looked at her, without this complicating it. She felt the room around them and the eyes on them, and the weight of everything that had been built to destroy them, and she felt, underneath all of it, the thing that had been building since the evening in the Aldrich penthouse when she'd asked him what happened if one of them fell in love, and he'd told her it wasn't in the contract. It's already complicated, she said. I know. Damien, she turned to face him fully, which meant the room could see it, which meant everyone watching. Solis, Voss, the men at the exit, the photographers, if any had gotten inside, would see a woman turning toward her husband with intention. Give the statement, tonight. Whatever it costs you, give it. Vivian, because we're not going to let him win. She said it quietly and directly and without theater. And because when this is over, I am not leaving. I want you to know that before you do it, not after, before. He looked at her for a long time, the controlled face, the precise eyes, and underneath them something that had been waiting a long time to be allowed to exist. You're certain, he said. I've been certain since the kitchen floor, she said. I was just waiting for you to catch up. Something happened in his expression that she'd never seen before. A complete and total release of everything he'd been holding in place just for a second, just long enough for her to see what was underneath all the discipline and the management and the 20 years of survival, and what was underneath it was not what she'd expected, which was the problem with assumptions about people who'd been forged in very high heat. All right, he said. He looked across the room at the federal contact by the windows. The woman caught his gaze and gave a single, almost invisible nod. Damien turned back to Vivian. Stay visible. Stay in the center of the room. Don't go anywhere alone. Where are you going? To end this, he said. He moved toward the windows. She watched him go, and then she turned to face the room. The whole room, the eyes and the politics and the threat of it. And she stood in the center of it alone, and held herself completely still and let them look. Because she had understood something in the last 3 minutes that Solis had not accounted for in any of his careful planning. He had built his trap around the assumption that the marriage was a transaction, that she was an asset Damien would sacrifice when the cost got high enough. He had not calculated for the possibility that she would choose to stay and that her choosing would change the geometry of everything. She watched Solis across the room as Damien reached the federal contact's position. She watched Solis watch Damien. She watched the moment Solis understood what was happening. It crossed his face in a fraction of a second, the recalculation, the fury under the neutrality, and she held his gaze across the crowded room and did not look away. Damien began to speak to the federal contact in a low, continuous, unhurried voice, and Vivian stood in the center of the gala and felt her pulse in her wrists and her hands and her throat. And she thought about North Light and unfinished libraries and a clause on page 107 that had tried to protect both of them from exactly this and had failed, and she was grateful it had failed. Solis's hand moved toward his jacket pocket, and the two men at the exit moved simultaneously, and Torres materialized from somewhere Vivian hadn't known he was, and the room began to understand that something was happening, the ambient sound shifting, people turning. And Vivian did not move, because moving was the wrong answer, because sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do in a collapsing situation was hold your ground and let the thing come at you, rather than give it something to chase. And she had learned that not from any contract or any course or any 11 years of building rooms for other people, but from 8 weeks inside a house with a man who understood that stillness, executed correctly, was its own form of force. The federal contact put her hand on Damien's arm. Torres had his hand on Solis's shoulder. The two men at the exit found, as they reached for whatever they'd planned to reach for, that there were other hands already there, quiet and prior and unambiguous. Damien turned from the windows and looked across the room at Vivian, and she breathed. The gala did not erupt the way Vivian had expected eruptions to work. There was no single moment of chaos, no shattering glass or overturned tables or the cinematic collapse of a room into violence. What happened instead was surgical and fast, and almost invisible to the 200 people who were still holding champagne flutes and performing their social obligations within 10 feet of it. Torres and two of his people moved Solis and his men toward a service corridor with the quiet efficiency of people who'd done this before, who understood that the most effective containment was the kind that looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. The federal contact, Special Agent Lana Marsh, which was the name Damien gave her in the car afterward, the first time he'd spoken her name in Vivian's presence, had two of her own people already positioned in the room, which was why she'd been visible. Vivian understood now, not because something had accelerated, but because the operation had already been running and the gala was where it was always going to land. The room recalibrated around the absence of threat the way rooms did when the threat had been subtle, barely noticing, redistributing attention, the ambient sound returning to its previous frequency within minutes. Vivian stood in the center of it and felt her pulse coming down from somewhere near her ears and thought about the specific quality of adrenaline, which was not dramatic but chemical, a change in blood composition that made everything slightly too bright and slightly too loud and then faded, leaving a residue of exhaustion that hit all at once. Damien came back to her side. His face was the disciplined face, completely managed, but his hand, when it found the back of her arm to guide her toward the exit, was not managed. The pressure of it was real. "We're leaving," he said. "Solis is in federal custody. The warrant was already prepared. Tonight was the execution." He steered her through the thinning edge of the crowd toward the elevator. "Torres will handle the estate. We need to go." "Why do we need to go?" "Because Solis had a contingency," he said, "which I knew was possible and which Marsh confirmed in the last 2 minutes. If the primary action failed, secondary instruction was issued to a team that is currently en route to the estate." She heard this and felt it land somewhere below her sternum, cold and specific. The estate. "Mrs. Aldridge has been moved. The staff have been moved. The property is currently occupied by Torres's secondary team and Marsh's people." He looked at her as the elevator opened. "We are not going back to the estate tonight." "Where are we going?" "Somewhere they don't know about," he said. "Get in." The car was already moving before the door fully closed, Torres's man at the wheel, a route that went south and then west in a series of turns that felt deliberately irregular. Vivian sat in the back beside Damien and felt the city moving past the windows in the dark, and felt him beside her, the proximity of him, the specific tension that came off a person who was managing something physical as well as situational. "You're in pain," she said. I'm fine. Damien. The chair, he said, clipped. Long events. It's nothing new. She looked at his hands on his thighs, the controlled placement of them, the pressure that wasn't quite stillness. She'd learned to read the difference. She said nothing more about it because he would not want her to, and because there were more immediate things, and because she had also learned that the way to honor a person's management of their own body was to address the actual emergency and let them handle themselves. Tell me about the contingency, she said. The team at the estate. What are they after? Documents. He looked straight ahead. Physical copies of the trust instrument modifications. The originals are held by the estate attorneys, but there are working copies at the house. If Solis's people get those documents and they're altered or destroyed, the restructuring loses its legal foundation. The restructuring becomes contestable for a minimum of 18 months in probate, during which Solis's organization, even with him in custody, can execute the asset freeze he's been positioning for. He turned to her. He doesn't need to be free to finish this. He just needs the documents to disappear tonight. Where are they? My office. East wing. Third drawer of the left side cabinet. Beneath the survey drawings. He held her gaze. Which is information I'm giving you because you need it, and because we are apparently past the point of managing what you know. We passed that point about 2 weeks ago, she said. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile but occupied similar territory. The car pulled into the underground parking structure of a building she didn't recognize. A residential tower in the West 50s, anonymous glass and steel, the kind of building that existed primarily to house people who needed to be unhousable. Torres's man pulled into a reserved space and killed the lights. Third floor, Torres said from the front seat. Unit 3B. Your people have it. Thank you, Damien said. He opened the door. The unit was a safe house, which she understood the moment she was inside it. Clean, functional, stocked, with the anonymous efficiency of a space that had been prepared for occupancy without being lived in. 2 of Damien's people were already there, plus a communications setup in the main room that was running live feeds from the estate's security cameras. She looked at the feeds, 4 screens, 4 angles on the estate grounds. The driveway was dark. The east wing was lit. They're already inside, she said. Yes. One of his people, a woman named Reyes, who had the compact efficiency of Torres but was faster talking, pulled up a closer feed. They came through the north wall, 2-man team, disabled the exterior system but not the interior. We have eyes on them. On the screen, 2 figures moved through the ground floor of the estate with the practiced speed of people who knew the layout, which meant someone had given them the layout, which meant the internal leak was not fully resolved or had been resolved too late. East Wing office, Damien said. How long? 2 minutes if they go direct, Reyes said. Can your people intercept? My people are holding the perimeter. If they go in now, it becomes a close-quarter situation in a residential space. And how many? 2 confirmed inside, possibly a 3rd on the north wall. Vivian was watching the screen. The 2 figures were moving through the entrance hall. Her entrance hall, the one with the warm lights she'd installed, the stone floor. And they moved through it without looking at anything because to them it was just a corridor and not a place, and she felt something hot and unambiguous move through her chest that was not fear. The survey drawings, she said, on your office table. They're on top of the cabinet. Damien looked at her. If someone moved the survey drawings onto the cabinet before we left, to cover the drawer, but the team would have to remove them first. That takes time. She looked at him. Did anyone move those drawings today? A pause. He looked at Reyes. Reyes shook her head. I moved them, Vivian said. This morning. I was in your office looking at the Red Hook surveys, and I left them on top of the cabinet when Torres called me. I didn't put them back. Another second of silence. Then Damien said, That gives us 90 seconds. Call Marsh, Vivian said. Right now, she has federal jurisdiction. She can authorize an interior operation in a way your people can't without... Already calling, Reyes said, the phone already at her ear. On the screen, one of the figures reached the east wing corridor and stopped, tested the office door, pushed it open. The second figure went directly to the cabinet. Come on, Vivian said to no one. To the feed. to the survey drawings that were sitting on top of the third drawer of the left side cabinet doing the only useful thing they'd ever been asked to do that wasn't about architecture. The figure at the cabinet swept the survey drawings off. They hit the floor. He pulled the first drawer, the second, the third. "Marsh is moving," Reyes said. 2 minutes. "They'll have it in 1, Damien said. On the screen, the figure's hands went into the third drawer and stopped. He pulled it fully open, rifled through it, stopped again, turned to the other figure. They exchanged something, too low, too fast for the audio to catch. Vivian leaned toward the screen. "It's not there," she said. Everyone in the room looked at her. "Where is it?" Damien said quietly. "Where did you actually keep it?" she said. "Not the working copies, the originals. You said the estate attorneys had them, but there were working copies at the house. Where were the working copies actually kept, not where someone with knowledge of your office layout would expect them?" His eyes changed. Something moved in them that was not quite surprise. More like the specific recognition of a man who'd built his survival on compartmentalization, looking at a woman who'd just demonstrated that she understood why. "My bedroom," he said. "East wing. There's a secondary safe behind the—" "They won't find that," she said. "Not in 2 minutes, and Marsh is already moving." On the screen, the figure at the cabinet was pulling every drawer now, fast and less careful, the efficiency of the original approach fracturing into urgency. The second figure moved toward the desk, pulled it open, papers across the floor. Reyes said, "Marsh is at the north wall, 30 seconds. "Pull your perimeter team back from the north," Damien said. "Give Marsh's people the approach." "Damien," one of his men started. "Do it." The man did it. On the secondary screen, 3 figures in tactical gear moved through the gap in the north wall where the estate team had been holding, moving fast and low and with the particular coordinated efficiency of people operating under federal authority. 40 seconds later, it was over. The feed showed it in real time. The East Wing office, the 2 figures on the floor with their hands behind their heads, Marsh's people over them, the survey drawings scattered across the hardwood like the aftermath of something that hadn't mattered as much as everyone had thought. The room in the safe house let out a collective breath that no one had announced they were holding. Vivian stepped back from the screens. Her knees were doing something she didn't like, a slight instability, the body presenting the bill for what it had spent in the last 3 hours. She put one hand on the back of a chair without making it obvious. Damien was beside her. She didn't know when he'd moved. "Sit down," he said, quiet. Not an order. The other kind. "I'm fine." "You're not fine, neither am I. Sit down." She sat. He stayed beside her. Reyes and the others were on phones, on radios, managing the aftermath in the efficient shorthand of people who'd done this before. And for a few minutes, the room was full of other people's work, and she and Damien were inside it, but not part of it, which was its own strange piece. "The documents are safe," he said. "Yes." "The restructuring holds." "Yes." Solis is in custody, and his secondary team is in federal hands, and Marsh has everything she needs for my statement. He said each of these things the way you said things when you were confirming them to yourself as much as the person beside you. "It's done." "Is it?" she said. "The operational threat. Yes." He was looking at the screens, which now showed Marsh's people working the estate systematically, orderly, the crisis reduced to its documentary aftermath. "There are still legal proceedings, the fraud complaint against you, the federal cooperation process on my end. None of that is fast." "How long?" "Months, possibly longer. The fraud complaint gets dismissed once the forensic analysis establishes the fabrication. Marsh's team will have access to Solis's digital infrastructure now, and the evidence of the compromise to your firm's email systems is in there. Rebecca will have what she needs." He paused. "But the proceeding itself, the cooperation, the restructuring formalization, months," she said again. "Not a complaint, a measurement." "Yes." She looked at the room, the safe house walls, anonymous and clean, the communications equipment, the residue of an emergency that had resolved into paperwork and legal proceedings, and the long, undramatic work of consequences. She thought about the 18-month contract that had brought her here, the clean arithmetic of it, The cold logic that had been the only language either of them had on that first night at the Aldrich, and she thought about how language changed when you used it for long enough, how the same words meant different things in November than they'd meant in September. "Damien," she said. "Yes." "The divorce papers you prepared." He was very still. "I know you prepared them," she said. "Rebecca mentioned it 3 days ago. Your attorneys contacted hers to verify certain procedural requirements." She held his gaze. "You were going to end the contract early, protect me from the fraud complaint by removing my connection to you before the gala." "It was a contingency," he said. "It was a sacrifice," she said. "You were going to remove me from the situation and absorb the cost of it yourself. Lose the restructuring, face Solus alone, let the business collapse if it had to get me clear of it." He said nothing. "That's what you were going to do." It seemed. He stopped. His jaw was tight, and the precision of his face was not working the way it usually worked. It seemed necessary to give you the option. "I told you at the gala," she said. "I told you before you gave the statement. I'm not leaving." "I heard you." "Then why are the papers still prepared?" "Because hearing you and believing you are not the same thing," he said, and it came out harder than he'd intended, the edge of something raw under it, something that had been compressed too long. "Because I have spent 20 years being the person that people move away from eventually. And because what you're feeling right now in this room after tonight, that's adrenaline and proximity and a situation that was designed to produce exactly this kind of—" "Don't do that," she said. "Vivian, don't explain my feelings to me." She leaned toward him, close enough that there was nothing abstract about the distance between them. "I moved your lights. I looked at your survey drawings. I spent 3 weeks figuring out what your house was supposed to be before whoever built it got the proportions wrong, and I fixed them because I couldn't leave them broken." She held his gaze. "I didn't do that for the contract. I did that because it's what I do when something matters to me. I fix the things that are broken. I don't walk away from them." His breathing had changed. She could hear it, slightly faster than his normal, the controlled bass line disrupted. "The guest wing library," she said. "I started the drawings. You didn't ask me to." "I know." "Because I want to finish it. I want to see what it becomes when it's done." She paused. "That's the only thing I know how to say it as. But you understand what I mean." He looked at her for a long time. The safe house hummed around them. Reyes said something into a radio across the room that neither of them heard. "I understand what you mean," he said. His hand moved slowly with the careful deliberation of a man who had decided to do something he could not take back, and found her hand where it rested on the arm of the chair and covered it, his fingers closing around hers with a pressure that was not tentative and was not managed and was not anything that belonged in a contract. She turned her hand over and held his back. They sat like that while the room worked around them, while the aftermath of the night organized itself into reports and calls and the long chain of procedural consequence. And neither of them spoke because there was, for once, nothing that needed to be said, nothing that required the precision of language. Just this: two people who had arrived at each other through the worst available route and had decided without a clause or a term or a legal instrument that they were staying. Reyes turned from the communications setup and looked at them. Something crossed her face, quickly, professionally suppressed, that might have been the specific expression of someone who had worked for Damien Blackwood for 6 years and had never once seen his hand in another person's. "Marcia's requesting a debrief," she said carefully. "Tonight, if possible." "In the morning," Damien said. He did not look up. Reyes absorbed this. "Understood." She turned back to the screens. The night extended around them. At some point, Reyes brought coffee, which sat on the table getting cold, and at some point the feeds from the estate settled into stillness, the crisis metabolized into the quiet of a secured property with nothing left to secure against. Vivian's head was heavy. She didn't fight it. She felt the weight of the last 8 weeks landing all at once in the place behind her eyes, where exhaustion lived when it had been deferred too long. She didn't remember closing her eyes. She was aware, at some level below consciousness, of a blanket being placed across her shoulders, the particular weight of it, the specific and careful way it was done. And she was aware that the hand that did it stayed for a moment at her shoulder before withdrawing, and she thought, somewhere in the half-dark of exhaustion, that she had never expected the thing about him that would undo her to be the carefulness. The precision that she'd read as coldness in the beginning and had learned week by week was something else entirely. The precision of a man who, when he decided something mattered, applied to it the full and undivided attention of everything he had. She slept. Damien sat beside her in the safe house and watched the screens go quiet and felt his hand, the hand that had held hers, resting on his thigh, and he thought about the divorce papers sitting in the top drawer of his estate office desk, prepared by his attorneys with his instruction and his signature, the exit he'd built for her out of the only material he'd trusted his entire life, which was the material of calculated sacrifice. He thought about the Red Hook surveys on his office table, covered in her pencil notations from a morning when he'd been in a meeting and she'd wandered in and done what she did without asking permission, which was look at something broken and begin, without announcement, to fix it. He thought about the clause on page 107. He picked up his phone and sent a message to his attorney. 3 words, cancel the papers. He set the phone face down on the table and looked at the woman asleep beside him and felt something that he had spent most of his adult life making sure he didn't feel because he had understood correctly that it was the most dangerous thing a man in his position could carry. He felt it anyway. He let it sit in his chest without managing it, without compressing it into something more functional, without building a clause around it. Outside the safe house windows, Manhattan continued its indifferent enormity, 10,000 lit windows, the city doing what it always did, which was existing at a scale that made human catastrophe feel very small, and human devotion feel, if you were willing to look at it correctly, like the only thing that wasn't. At 3 a.m, Reyes's radio crackled with Marsh's voice. "Solis is talking," Marsh said. "He wants a deal." Reyes looked at Damien. "Tell her," Damien said, "that whatever he's offering, it needs to include full written disclosure of his contact with Marcus Holt. Every communication, every instruction, every dollar." His voice was quiet, but there was nothing gentle in it. "Tell her we'll discuss terms in the morning, not before." Reyes relayed this. Marsh's voice came back. "She says understood. She also says—" Reyes paused, something crossing her face. "She says the forensic team got into Solis's servers. The fabricated email evidence. They have the construction record, timestamps, authorship metadata, the works." Reyes looked at Vivian, asleep, then back at Damien. "The fraud complaint against Mrs. Blackwood is going to collapse by morning." Damien held this for a moment. The specific weight of it. Not triumph, something quieter, the particular relief of a wrong being corrected that had cost more than it should have. "Good," he said. The room settled back into its working quiet. Reyes turned to the screens. The estate feeds showed nothing moving. The city outside pressed its light against the windows. Damien looked at Vivian and thought about 18 months, the number he'd chosen because it had seemed sufficient, the clean arithmetic of an exit built into an entrance, the contract he'd written around both of them to make sure neither one could get close enough to do exactly what had happened anyway. He thought about what she'd said at the gala. "I've been certain since the kitchen floor." He thought about the kitchen floor and the night she'd arrived, and the first dinner in the too large dining room, and every small subsequent thing that had accrued into this specific configuration of 2 people in a safe house at 3 a.m. on the other side of the worst night of both their lives. And he thought that the contract had failed at its central purpose, which had been to keep them at a distance from each other, and he thought that this was the best failure he had ever been party to. His phone lit up. His attorney's response, confirmed, papers voided. He set the phone down. Outside, without announcement, it began to snow. The first snow of the season, early, wet, the kind that didn't stick but fell with the particular insistence of something that had decided its timing regardless of what the calendar said, covering the city in a temporary and impermanent white that would be gone by morning and was, for the hours that it lasted, exact. Damien watched it hit the windows and felt his hand, still on his thigh, still warm from hers, and he understood, with the clarity of a man who had finally stopped managing a thing that didn't want to be managed. that the 18 months was over, in any form that it ever mattered, and what came next had no number attached to it, no termination clause, no legal instrument that could contain it or end it on a predetermined date. What came next was the thing itself, uncontracted, unmanaged, real. And the morning was coming, which meant Marsh and the debrief and the long procedural work of what came after, and Solis's deal and Marcus Holt's name on a disclosure document, and the fraud complaint collapsing into the forensic evidence that proved what Vivian had said on day one, that she hadn't done anything wrong, that the thing she'd been accused of was a fabrication, that 11 years of real work deserved the protection of a truth that had taken too long to surface. All of that was coming, but not yet. Not for a few more hours. For now there was the snow and the quiet room and the woman asleep beside him and the canceled papers in a drawer he would never open again. And Damian Blackwood, who had built his entire life on the principle that controlled distance was the only safe architecture, sat in the warmth of his own undoing and did not try to fix it. The morning came the way mornings came after the worst nights. Not gently, not with any particular consideration for the people it found, just light arriving through windows, and the city resuming its indifference and the specific flatness of a world that had continued while you weren't watching it. Vivian woke on a safe house couch with a blanket across her shoulders that she hadn't put there herself, and a crick in her neck from 3 hours of sleep in a position her body had not endorsed. She was aware of where she was before she was fully conscious of it. The communications equipment, the quiet of a room that had been loud hours earlier, the weak gray light of a November morning pressing through curtains that weren't designed for aesthetics. Damian was at the table. He had coffee and a document and the particular quality of a man who had not slept but had used the hours productively, which she was beginning to understand was simply what he did. Converted sleeplessness into work, converted crisis into logistics, converted the unmanageable into the managed, at whatever personal cost the conversion required. He looked up when she sat up. "There's coffee," he said. "I see it." She reached for the mug closest to her and felt the warmth of it against her palms. Outside, the snow from the night before had done exactly what early season snow in New York always did. Disappeared without ceremony, leaving the streets wet and the morning colorless. "What time is it?" 6:40. "Marsh. 8 o'clock. Here." He turned the document toward her. It was a summary, 2 pages, dense but organized, of what the forensic team had pulled from Solis's servers in the preceding hours. She read it with the coffee in one hand, her eyes moving down the columns of information with the same attention she gave structural drawings, looking for the load-bearing elements. The fabricated emails were documented completely. The metadata trail led from Solis's digital infrastructure through 3 intermediary servers to a terminal that forensic analysts had traced to an address in Singapore, Marcus Holt's address, confirmed by immigration records that Marsh's team had obtained by 4 in the morning. The construction of the fraudulent documents had begun 22 months ago, which meant Marcus had been building her destruction for nearly 2 years while sitting across from her in their shared office, refilling her coffee, attending groundbreakings, performing the complete role of a trusted partner. She set the summary down. 22 months, she said. Yes. She absorbed this. The arithmetic of it. 22 months of parallel lives, the real one and the constructed one, both running simultaneously, Marcus managing the seam between them with enough precision that she'd never felt the gap. She tried to locate what she felt about it and found something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite fury, but contained both, compressed into a single dense thing that sat in her chest without a clean name. "Rebecca will file the dismissal motion today," Damian said. "Marsh's office is providing a supporting declaration. The fraud complaint will be withdrawn by end of week. And Marcus, Interpol request is filed. Singapore has an extradition arrangement." He paused. "It will take time." "Will it actually happen?" He held her gaze. "I don't know. That depends on things I don't control." He said it without evasion, which she appreciated more than reassurance would have. "But the evidence record is complete. If he's ever in a jurisdiction that honors the arrangement, yes." She nodded. She drank her coffee. She thought about Marcus in Singapore with his $300,000, and his fabricated emails and his 2 years of performance, and she thought about the specific texture of betrayal that came from someone who had known you well, who had used the knowing against you, who had assembled your own language into a weapon and aimed it at the life you'd built together. And she thought that there was no version of justice that returned those 22 months or unmade what had been done with them. What there was this. Morning. Coffee. The evidence in federal hands, the fraud complaint collapsing, and across the table, a man who had spent the night voiding divorce papers and watching snow. She decided that this was enough. Not because it was everything, but because it was what was real, and she had spent enough of her life in the architecture business to understand that you built with the materials you had, not the ones you wished for. The debrief with Marsh took 3 hours. Special Agent Lena Marsh conducted it in a conference room in the federal building on Worth Street, which was a room designed to feel neutral and achieved something closer to colorless, the specific bureaucratic beige of spaces that had processed too many serious conversations to retain any particular character. She was precise and thorough, and she moved through the night's events with the systematic efficiency of someone who had been building toward this for 18 months and was now harvesting it with professional care. Solis had spent the early morning hours providing the kind of cooperation that men in his position provided when the alternative had been fully explained to them by attorneys with accurate assessments of his exposure. He had confirmed the contact with Marcus Holt, confirmed the engineering of the embezzlement scheme, confirmed the shooting 2 years earlier with enough operational detail to close what had been an open investigation file at 3 different law enforcement agencies. He had provided names, dates, financial records, and the identities of his intermediaries in a package that Marsh described as comprehensive, with the particular flatness of someone who did not allow satisfaction to show before the paperwork was signed. Vivian sat through the portions that concerned her directly and answered Marsh's questions with the precision of a woman who had learned in the preceding weeks that precision was the only currency that held its value when everything else was in motion. She confirmed the timeline of the firm's financial irregularities as she'd experienced them, confirmed the sequence of events that had led her to Damien, confirmed what she knew about the text message and the Brandt Gallery and the gala. She did not embellish, she did not editorialize. She gave Marsh exactly what she had and nothing she didn't. Marsh looked at her at the end with an expression that held something Vivian recognized after a moment as respect, the specific kind that came from watching someone operate under pressure and finding them accurate. "The State Board inquiry," Marsh said, "will be providing a letter to the Board of Architecture confirming that you were a victim of the scheme, not a participant. That should resolve the professional licensing question." "Thank you," Vivian said. "Don't thank me. The evidence did it." Marsh glanced at Damien. "Both pieces of evidence." She let that sit for a moment. The forensic evidence from Solis's servers and the statement Damien had given her the night before, the one that had cost him the things it had cost him. "My office will be in contact with your respective attorneys regarding the ongoing cooperation process and the federal proceedings against Solis." She stood. They stood. She shook both their hands with the firm economy of a woman who had been doing this for 20 years and had mastered the containment of ceremony. "Mr. Blackwood," she said at the door. She paused. "The statement you gave last night, I want you to know that I understand what it cost." Damien looked at her with his managed face. "I know you do," he said. She left. The room held her absence for a moment and then became just a room again. They drove back to the estate in the early afternoon through the Westchester suburbs and past them, the oaks closing around the driveway the way they always did, and the house came into view against the gray November sky and looked, for the first time since she'd arrived in it, like something she was returning to rather than something she was entering. The staff had come back. Mrs. Aldridge met them in the entrance hall with the controlled expression of a woman who had spent a night in an evacuation and was not going to give it more acknowledgement than professional composure required. "The East Wing office will need attention," Mrs. Aldridge said. "The team that secured the property last night was thorough." "I'll handle it," Vivian said. Mrs. Aldridge looked at her with the expression she'd worn at the beginning, the one Vivian had filed, as we'll see. And it had changed. It was not warm, exactly, Because Mrs. Z. Aldridge did not do warm as a primary register, but it was something adjacent to warm. Something in the range of you turned out to be what you appeared to be, which from a woman like Mrs. Aldridge was the highest available form of approval. She went to the East Wing office alone. The survey drawings were on the floor where Solis's men had left them, scattered across the hardwood in the careless aftermath of a search that had found nothing because the thing it was looking for had been behind a different door. She gathered them carefully, the way you gathered drawings that mattered, holding the edges without creasing them, restoring the order of the sheets by the numbering she'd marked in pencil in the corners. She stacked them on the drafting table. She looked at the office, the drawers pulled out, the desk ransacked, the filing cabinet with its contents disturbed, and she thought about what it would take to restore it, not just to its previous state, but to something better, something that was actually what it wanted to be, rather than what it had been arranged to look like. She thought about the library room in the guest wing. She went upstairs and stood in the doorway of it for a long time. The afternoon light was doing what afternoon light in November did in a west-facing room, coming in low and amber and without apology, and it hit the pencil marks on the wall. The measurements Damien had made, however long ago, in the period before the shooting, when he'd been standing in this room with some idea of what it could become, and turned them gold. She walked to the wall and put her hand flat against it. Felt the plaster, original, the specific texture of it. She looked at the proportions of the space with the deep attention she gave to things she intended to build, measuring with her eyes, understanding the structural logic of the room, the ceiling height, and the window placement, and the particular quality of the light at this hour. She understood what it wanted to be. She'd understood since the first afternoon she'd stood here. She'd been waiting for permission to say it out loud, and she was done waiting. She went to the studio and got her pencil. She worked until dinner, and then through dinner, and Damien found her at 9 in the evening kneeling on the floor of the guest wing room with a measuring tape and a sketch pad, and the look of a woman who had decided something. He stood in the doorway. "The estate attorneys came by," he said. "The trust instrument review is complete. The restructuring is proceeding." "Good," she said without looking up from the measurement she was recording. "It will take 6 to 8 months for the full legal formalization. The cooperation agreement with Marsh's office requires—" "I know what it requires," she said. "Rebecca walked me through it this afternoon." She sat back on her heels and looked at the wall. "There needs to be a window on the north face. The original plans didn't include one, but the wall is non-load-bearing, and the light from the north at this latitude is— it's what makes a library instead of just a room with books in it." He was quiet. "The shelving should run floor to ceiling on the east and south walls," she said, "with a rolling ladder, the kind on a track, not the kind you have to move manually. The floor is original oak under the paint. I checked. It needs to be stripped, not replaced." She stood up and turned to look at him in the doorway. "And you should have a chair in the northwest corner where the afternoon light comes in. Something that was chosen because it was comfortable and not because it looked correct." He looked at her, the doorframe, the pencil marks on the wall in the amber light. "You're designing my library," he said. "I'm finishing your library," she said. "You started it." He moved into the room. She watched him look at it the way she'd learned to watch him look at things. The full attention, the quiet assessment, the processing that happened behind the precise face. He moved to the north wall she'd indicated and put his hand against it, the same gesture she'd made 10 minutes earlier, and she felt something move through her chest that she was no longer pretending not to recognize. "The window would change the whole room," he said. "That's the point of a window," she said. He turned from the wall and looked at her, and she saw, in his face, the thing that had been building since September. Not the management of it, not the claws that tried to contain it, just the thing itself, unarchitected, existing in the north-facing room in the November evening with nowhere to go except where it was. "The contract expires in 6 weeks," he said. "I know. My attorneys prepared—" "I know what your attorneys prepared," she said. "You canceled them. Torres told me." She held his gaze. "Torres tells me a lot of things. I'll need to have a conversation with Torres about that." "You should have that conversation," she said, "after you answer my question." "What question?" She took 2 steps toward him and stopped, close enough that the distance between them was no longer a space either of them had chosen, just the place where they'd arrived. "The 18 months," she said. "When you chose the number, was it because you thought it was enough time to do what needed to be done legally, or was it because you thought it was not enough time to—" She stopped, said it directly. "Was it a limit you built to protect yourself?" He didn't answer immediately. She watched him not answer, watched the internal cost of the honesty he was deciding to give, and she thought that this was what she had come to love about him, not the precision itself, but what the precision protected. Something inside it that was not hard at all, something that had been kept very safe for a very long time, and was only now beginning to believe that the walls around it were not the only option. "Yes," he said. "Okay," she said. "Vivian, I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I want you to understand that. Not in 6 weeks, not after the legal proceedings, not when the restructuring is formalized and you don't need the arrangement anymore. I am not leaving because I have decided not to leave, and I would like you to stop building exits for me." He looked at her for a long time. "You are the most difficult contract I have ever entered into," he said. "I know," she said. "I have strong opinions about the terms." His mouth did the thing it did, the almost smile that she'd spent 4 months learning to read, and this time it completed itself, fully, without the management catching it in time. And she saw it for what it was. The real thing, unarchitected. His face doing something it didn't do for the benefit of rooms or negotiations or the performance of stability. It did it for her. "I want to build the library," she said, quieter now. "All right," he said. "And the Red Hook property, the one with the harbor orientation. I want to design it properly. Full project, my name on it." "It's your design," he said. "It was always going to be your design. And I want—" She stopped. She found the words she'd been circling for a long time and said them simply, without ceremony, because ceremony was not her register, and he would not have believed it from her anyway. "I want to not have an end date anymore. I want that to be the last term I negotiate." The room was very still. The amber light had deepened into the blue edge of early evening, the room shifting the way rooms shifted in November when the day gave up its last warmth, and the pencil marks on the north wall were just shadows now, the measurements of an unfinished thing waiting to be completed. "That's not in any contract I've written," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's not." He reached out and she took his hand, and they stood in the unfinished library in the house that had been dead when she arrived and was no longer, and neither of them spoke, because the thing between them did not require language at this point, and had perhaps never required it, had been built in the other currency. The survey drawings, and the warm lights, and the North studio, and the canceled divorce papers, and a blanket placed across sleeping shoulders at 3 a.m. The currency of people who showed each other things instead of saying them. The weeks that followed were procedural and unglamorous, the way the aftermath of dramatic events almost always was. Not resolution arriving in a single clean moment, but in a series of meetings, filings, letters, phone calls, and the slow administrative machinery of institutions processing what had happened to them. Rebecca filed the dismissal motion on a Tuesday, and the fraud complaint was withdrawn by Thursday, as Marsh had indicated it would be, the Ardent Capital attorneys pulling the supplemental filing with a terseness that suggested they were aware of how badly they'd been used. Rebecca called Vivian with the news in the brief, controlled tone of someone who had learned, over 9 years, not to over-celebrate legal victories until the ink dried on the right documents. "It's done," Rebecca said. "Good," Vivian said. She was at the drafting table in the studio. The Red Hook drawings were spread in front of her, the design nearly finished now, the harbor-facing orientation locked in. "Thank you, Rebecca." "Don't thank me," Rebecca said. "The evidence did it." She paused. "I'm glad you didn't leave." "I know you are," Vivian said. "I'll call you Thursday." The state board letter came the following week. Her license was confirmed intact, the inquiry closed, the record annotated with Marsh's supporting declaration in a way that would follow the case file rather than her professional record. She read it at the kitchen table and set it aside and went back to the Red Hook drawings, because the news was what she'd expected, and the drawings needed her more than the news did. The construction began on the guest wing library in January. She ran it herself, sourcing the materials and overseeing the contractors with the authority of a woman who had rebuilt a practice from zero and had precise ideas about how the ceiling height needed to read against the floor-to-ceiling shelving she'd specified on the east and south walls. The north window went in on the third day of construction, and when it did, the room changed character in exactly the way she'd known it would. The light entering differently, the space acquiring the specific quality of a room that had finally been given what it needed to become itself. Damien came to look at it on the fourth day, when the shelving was partially installed. He was quiet for a long time, the way he was quiet when something mattered. "The chair," he said eventually, "in the northwest corner." "It's coming," she said. "I found the right one. It took some looking." "What is it?" "You'll see when it arrives." He looked at her with the expression she'd catalogued over 5 months. The precise face with the thing underneath it that she understood now, the only person currently alive who regularly saw. "You like making me wait," he said. "I like getting it right," she said. "Those are different things." "Are they?" She turned back to the shelving specification she was reviewing. "Ask me when the chair arrives." The chair arrived on a Friday. It was a deep leather reading chair, the color of old cognac, worn in the specific way that furniture was worn when it had been genuinely used rather than artificially aged. She'd found it in a salvage place in Brooklyn that she'd been to twice before for estate projects, and she'd known it was right the moment she saw it. The proportions, the depth of the seat, the way it would hold a person without performing comfort. She had it placed in the northwest corner while Damien was in a meeting. She texted him, "Library." He came in 3 minutes. He looked at the chair in the corner, in the northwest light, which at this hour in January was the low winter sun coming through the new window at exactly the angle she'd designed it for. He went to it. He looked at it for a moment. He sat down in it. The fit of it was exactly right. She'd calculated the height of the armrests against the width of his chair's armrests specifically, had measured twice before ordering, because getting it wrong would have been worse than not doing it at all. He sat in the chair in the northwest corner of the library that had been an unfinished pencil-marked room for 2 years and looked at the half-installed shelving and the new north window and the original oak floors stripped back to their honest grain, and he held the armrests of the chair with the particular grip of a man who was holding something to make sure it was real. Vivian stood in the doorway and watched him. "Well?" she said. He looked up at her. His face was doing the thing again, the thing she'd decided was the best thing she'd ever seen a face do, the precision giving way to the real thing underneath. "It's right," he said. "I know," she said. She came into the room and sat on the edge of the built-in window seat she'd specified beneath the new north window, and they were quiet together in the library that was becoming itself, the winter light doing its honest work, and outside the windows the estate grounds were bare and gray, in the way January grounds were bare and gray, and the oak trees that absorbed sound and light were doing it without any special effort. And the city was 50 minutes south and contained everything that had tried to destroy both of them and had not managed it. The 18th month arrived on a March morning when the grounds were beginning to consider the possibility of spring, the specific moment when the earth's color shifts from the gray of bare soil to something with a suggestion of green in it, still far from warmth, but no longer fully committed to winter. She woke up knowing the date. She had not marked it, had not noted it on any calendar, but the body kept certain kinds of time without being asked, and she knew. She went downstairs. Damien was at the kitchen table with coffee and the Wall Street Journal and the expression of a man who had also woken up knowing the date and had decided to be at the kitchen table doing ordinary things, which was, she understood now, how he processed the things that mattered most, not with ceremony, but with presence, with the choice to be in the room. She poured her coffee. She sat across from him. He looked up from the paper. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she got up and went to the studio. She came back with 2 pieces of paper. She set them on the table between the coffee mugs and the newspaper. 2 copies of the original contract summary page, the 1-page condensed version that their attorneys had prepared at signing as a reference document, bearing both their signatures at the bottom. She set a lighter beside them. He looked at the documents. He looked at her. "You kept these," he said. One copy was in my files, she said. The other was in your estate office. Third drawer, left cabinet. I retrieved it while the contractors were working. Of course you did, he said. She picked up the lighter. She held it out to him. He took it. He looked at it in his hand for a moment, the small, ordinary object with its specific implication, and then he looked at her with the full attention she had come to understand was the most valuable thing he had ever given anyone, including everything he'd built, and everything he'd sacrificed, and everything he'd converted into something legitimate over the slow, hard years of deciding who he intended to become. He lit the first document. They watched it catch. He lit the second. They held them until they had to let them go, and then they let them go, and the contracts burned in the clean, cold light of a March morning in a kitchen that had once been silent and was not anymore, and the ash that remained was small and specific, and she swept it into her hand and took it to the window and let the morning air take it. "Vivian," he said behind her. She turned. He had moved to the kitchen doorway, and his face had the expression she loved most, the one with nothing between the surface and the thing beneath it, the one that cost him something to show and which he showed her anyway. "I would like to ask you something," he said. "You don't have to ask," she said. "I already know what I'm going to say." "I would still like to ask." She came back to the table. She stood across from him, the burned paper smell still in the air, the March light doing its early tentative work through the kitchen windows, and she waited. "Will you stay?" he said. "Not the contract version. The real one." "Yes," she said. They married again in May, which was not a large event and was not performed for anyone's benefit except their own. Rebecca was there, and Torres and Reyes and Mrs. Aldridge in a hat she'd clearly purchased specifically for the occasion and would never acknowledge having purchased. The judge who performed the ceremony was the same judge who had signed off on the restructuring's final legal formalization 3 weeks earlier, which Vivian found appropriate. The same legal architecture completing 2 different buildings on the same foundations. Damien held her hand through the whole of it. She noticed this not because it was unexpected, but because it was the specific, unhurried, unperforming version of the gesture, the grip of a man who was not managing how it looked, but simply doing the thing itself. And she thought that this was what 5 months and the worst available route and an unfinished library and a contract burned on a kitchen table had produced, the ability to do the real thing without constructing a clause around it. Afterward, the small group moved to the estate, where the library was now complete. The shelving ran floor to ceiling. The north window held the May light in exactly the color she'd designed it to hold, and the cognac-colored chair sat in the northwest corner looking as if it had always been there, which was the highest thing you could say about a piece of furniture in a room, that it looked as if it had always known where it belonged. She stood in the doorway of it late in the afternoon, when the guests had moved to the garden and the house was holding its breath between the end of one thing and the beginning of the next. Damien came to stand beside her. "You should put a book on the shelf," she said. "First book." "What book?" "Whichever one you'd have put there before, the one you had in mind when you made the pencil marks." He was quiet for a moment. Then he went to the side table she'd specified next to the chair and picked up the volume that had been sitting there. She'd noticed it, but not commented on it. And he set it on the middle shelf of the east wall at eye height, the natural place, the place a hand would reach for without thinking. She looked at the spine. A history of New York's built environment, 1880 to present. She looked at him. "You've been reading about architecture," she said. "For a while," he said. She thought about the North Light and the Red Hook surveys and the questions he'd asked at dinner that built on each other. And she thought about the ways people showed you what they were paying attention to when they thought you weren't watching, and she thought that she had been watched and had not known it for a long time, and that this was not a threatening knowledge, but its opposite, the specific warmth of being seen by someone who looked at things carefully. "The Red Hook project breaks ground in September," she said. "I know. I've been looking at the harbor elevation drawings." "What do you think?" "I think the orientation is right," he said. "I think the water-facing facade is going to do something unexpected in the winter light, and you already know that, and you've accounted for it." She looked at him. "You've been learning my language," she said. "You learned mine," he said. "It seemed fair." The garden was audible through the library's new window, the quiet sounds of a small gathering of people who had reason to be there and knew it. And the May afternoon was doing what May afternoons in Westchester did when they were good, existing with a quality of warmth that was earned rather than given. The sun at an angle that made the new leaves on the oaks look like something lit from within. She looked at the library, the finished thing, the room that had been pencil marks on a wall and was now shelves and light and a chair in the right corner and a first book on the right shelf. And she looked at the man beside her who had built this house around the idea of controlling every variable and had lost that control entirely to a woman who showed up in his entrance hall on a gray Saturday in October with her whole professional life in ruins and proceeded to fix his lights. She put her hand in his. "It's a good room," she said. "It is," he said. "We should build more of them." He looked at her, the afternoon light in the new window, the first book on the shelf. "Yes," he said, "we should." Outside the library window, the oak trees held the light the way they held everything, quietly, without display. The old wood doing what it had always done in the decades before either of them arrived and would continue to do long after, which was simply stand in its own ground and let the seasons move through it, one after another, each one taking what the last one left and building something from it, patient and unhurried and uncontracted, the way living things grew when the conditions were finally right.